I'm a retired park ranger and now live in Illinois, and I've been a camp host since 2016. It's a relaxing job for someone who loves the outdoors. It doesn't pay much, but you can set up your camper in a picturesque location and camp for free all summer, so that really was the appeal for me. I'm there for all the campers who have problems, and to be honest, that hardly ever happens. Most weeks go by with me only talking to one or two of the campers occupying the sites, just chit-chat, and I also make the rounds every night at dusk to sell firewood out of my pickup truck. I had talked to the young couple in campsite number 7 when they first arrived, and we had a nice chat. They were in their mid-20s and planned to do some hiking in the area. They had a little white dog with them, a mixed breed, I think, and they said it loved to camp. I was a little concerned one day when I didn't see the couple as I made my rounds in the evening. I took a peek again at 11:30 p.m., and they still weren't back. They told me they were staying for a week, and their tent was still up, and their car was there. People have to register if they plan to backcountry camp, and they hadn't registered to do that, nor had they mentioned any plans of that sort. At first, I thought maybe they had some friends in the area that had picked them up and were staying over in town for a night. But when the second night came and they still weren't back, I began to get worried. Now, I'm not a babysitter. People can come and go as they please. And at the time, I thought it was possible that I just kept missing them. After all, I couldn't see their site from my camp host site. But the next morning after that second night, I went to clean the restrooms, and I drove by their campsite. Alarm bells immediately went off. Their little dog was there, sniffing all over the ground, and their tent had blown down. I walked over, and the dog trotted up and licked my hand, whining. He seemed so grateful to see someone. I called hello a few times, but I could tell his owners weren't in the area, so I scooped the little fellow back up and brought him back to my site to give him some food. Poor thing gobbled up a hamburger like he was starving. His coat was all dirty with twigs caught in it, and he was trembling, so I decided to call my supervisor. I reported the couple as potentially lost in the woods, and the authorities sent out a small search party. I volunteered to take care of the pup while we waited. I really felt bad for the little guy. It took almost a whole day, but I was greatly relieved when a truck rolled in with the young couple in the passenger seat. They were dirty and scratched up, and the volunteer that brought them in took me aside and said he thought they were suffering from hallucinations. He had already radioed in that they'd been found, so I knew there would be paperwork to fill out. I lent them a couple of blankets to wrap up in and made some coffee. The woman was so happy to see her dog she burst into tears. Then they told me what had happened. The man said they'd been hiking along the ridge, and their dog started barking at something behind them. He said they were afraid it was a bear, since they both were carrying food in their backpacks. "You're not supposed to do that," I said. They scooped up the dog and made a lot of noise, clapping their hands and talking loud, trying to scare it off, but then the woman spotted it. She said it absolutely was not a bear. She told her husband it looked like a gorilla, but it was smart, hiding behind the trees whenever they stopped. She was really shaken up, so he told me most of the story himself. The fellow said at first he didn't believe her. He thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but then the creature got bolder and came out in the open. He told me it had to be 7 feet tall and it had massive arms and legs, standing on 2 legs and covered in fur, all except for its face. I looked the young man in the eye as he told me this, and it was plain he believed what he was saying. I've had my share of lies told to me being a school teacher for 27 years, but this fellow wasn't lying. He said he believed this creature was the Bigfoot. He told me it started acting aggressive, stalking them, and they had no choice but to run. The poor woman started crying as her husband told me the next part. They were so scared of the creature that when the little dog slipped out of her grasp, he grabbed her arm and wouldn't let her stop running. It was going to attack us, he said. I felt bad, but we had to get away. They wound up hiding in one of the caves up on the ridge. He said once they got to higher ground, they started throwing rocks at it and kicking logs and debris down the side of the mountain, trying to make a rock slide so it couldn't reach them. It stayed down below, making these horrible screeches of anger, he said, all through the night, while they stayed up in higher elevation, trying to find shelter and stockpiling rocks and fallen limbs for ammunition. The next morning, they didn't see it and tried to find their way back, but they'd gotten so turned around when they were running that they found themselves hopelessly lost. They spent their second night up in a tree, he said, using straps on their backpacks to loop over limbs so they wouldn't fall. They were both dirty and covered in scratches, and it was not a stretch to believe they had been fighting to survive. But then the forest rangers showed up. They listened rather skeptically and suggested it was a bear. The couple disagreed, and the rangers became irritated, really tearing down their story. The man finally lost his cool and said he didn't care what they thought. It wasn't a bear, and he was going to go to the local news and report what he'd seen. That's when things got ominous. One of the many vehicles that had rolled back in with the search teams was a black SUV. No one had emerged from the vehicle until that moment. It sounds crazy, but I wonder if they had a listening device in the vehicle, because once the young man started getting irate, this fellow got out. He came up to the couple and said something in a low tone that I couldn't hear, and flashed some ID. Next thing I know, he escorts them over to the SUV, and they all got in, even the dog, and drove away. I asked the ranger who that was, and he looked around like he was afraid to be caught telling and mumbled, "Homeland Security." I don't know what to think of that. I never saw the couple again. I got up the next morning and their campsite was cleared out. I caught the story on the local news, and it said the missing couple had been found by the search team, unhurt. All the story said was they had gotten lost in the forest. So I guess that young man never got to tell the local news what he saw after all. I've lived in New York City my whole life. I grew up on the Lower East Side. We have a lot of pride down there, and we aren't afraid to show it. I always loved the city, and as a kid, we thought we were the biggest stuff. I remember nodding to the police officer on our block and getting the nod back. That made me feel like such a big shot. Living in the city means that you will see some weird stuff. It's completely unpredictable. Sometimes it's cool and happy, like the big parades and New Year's celebrations. Sometimes it's just plain sad, like when you hear the sirens start going off in the middle of the night and never stopping. It's a big city with a lot of weird stuff in it. I remember the first time I thought I saw something weird. It's nowhere near as strange as what I'm actually writing to you about. No, this one is small potatoes compared to that, but I'm going to start with the small story and build up. I was out biking with my buddy and it was really hot out. Our air conditioner wasn't working, so riding bikes around was basically the only way to feel any relief from the hot air. August in the city is really stifling with all that heat reflecting off the pavement and buildings. Anyways, we were biking when I saw something in the storm drain. It was like two yellow floating lights peeking out at me. Did you ever see that dumb movie? Yeah, it was like that stupid clown demon thing in the gutter, but just yellow eyes. I was riding my bike fast and didn't get a great glimpse of it. I really didn't think I thought much of it as a kid. I remembered it immediately after this last encounter, though. That bike incident happened like 20 years ago. I ended up getting a pretty good job right out of high school. I never went to college, though. School just wasn't my thing. I tried to study hard, but it never came easy. Maybe I have one of those learning disabilities or something. Maybe I have some bigger issue in my head, like I'm a psycho or something, and that explains why I've seen these weird things. I don't know, I'm just trying to grasp any possible semi-logical reason. Anyways, the real big potato story. So, out of high school, I started working. I started working for the NYC sewer utility as basically a grunt worker. It kind of sucked, but I got health insurance and my mom needed medicine for her blood pressure. We didn't have much money growing up, so I viewed it as a way to give back to her for everything she gave me. I could put up with the nastiness of it all for that. Eventually, I got good at my job, and the bosses noticed that. They say hard work pays off, and it sure did for me. I eventually got upgraded to an inspector and have basically worked by myself ever since then. NYC has a sewer system called a combined sewer. About 60% of all the sewers in the city are this combined sewer. That means that all the little sewers and drains that come out of the buildings feed into one really big pipe. I spent a lot of time alone in those really big pipes, making sure that they'd be ready in case of a big storm, like Superstorm Sandy. So, this really brings me to the whole reason why I'm writing to you now. I was down in one of these big combined drains all by myself, just like any other day. I was having a good time that day and moving fast. I wanted to get out of work early to take my mom to the doctor. These combined sewers are usually pretty dry, unless it's right after a big storm or something. It hadn't rained in a week or two, so it was unusual that this combined sewer had the amount of water in it that it did. It was a solid 2 or 3 feet extra of water, and that's the first weird thing that stuck out to me. The second weird thing that stuck out to me was that there was obviously something moving in the water. I've had to deal with this before. People's idiot cats fall down a drain, or a raccoon gets stuck, or something dumb like that, and they end up splashing and drowning, and I have to call animal control. That's what I thought all the ripples were. It's pretty dark down in those sewers, but I could tell that whatever was moving in that water was bigger than a raccoon. I tried to shine my light on it, and when I did, I saw something really weird. It was scaly and spiny and moving fast through the water. I totally froze when I saw that, with all the stories of alligators in the sewers coming into my head. I beamed my light on and watched as it moved down the sewer tunnel. Eventually the angle wasn't right and I couldn't see it anymore. There was lots of debris in the water and I really second-guessed myself, thinking maybe it was a branch or something. I know that it wasn't because of what I saw next. Remember those yellow eyes I'd seen as a kid, looking at me out of the sewer? I swear they were looking at me again like 100 feet away, straight out of the darkness. And it wasn't just one set of eyes. I swear I counted 5 sets of them. All yellow, staring straight out at me, making eye contact with me. I'm pretty sure I saw one of them blink. I have never moved so fast through a sewer tunnel, up the ladder, across the parking lot, and into my truck. My heart was pounding as I sat in my truck. I got another inspector to check out that tunnel with me, and he swore he didn't see anything. This is why maybe I think I have something wrong in my head. I can't find any explanation for what I saw. After settling in and ordering, my dad asked me if I'd experienced anything weird at my college. It's a well-known school in the far north of the Northeast and has a ton of haunted history. I told him that I'd never personally experienced anything, but a lot of the students in my building have seen things here and there. Mostly ghostly figures that are said to roam the grounds. I explained that I wasn't opposed to seeing something and was thinking of going out late at night with a few friends who also hadn't had a ghost experience yet. My dad, sitting across the booth from me, shuddered and said I should just avoid those kinds of encounters at all costs. That, of course, caught my attention immediately. Neither of my parents are very religious, and I can't remember them ever talking about anything supernatural or paranormal. But it sounded like my dad had some personal experience here, a reason behind his warning. I kept it casual, knowing that prying too hard would probably make him clam up, and asked him if he'd ever experienced anything himself. He mulled it over for a while. Our food was served, so we got interrupted, but eventually grunted and admitted that he had, when he was about my age. For some background, my dad grew up near the shore in New England. He lived in a coastal town that today has a small commercial fishing fleet, a submarine factory, and a power plant, all on the mouth of a river. I've only been there once or twice, the last time, right after my grandmother passed and we cleared out their house. It was sad, but nothing spooky. I thought the town was cool, very beach-centered with seafood shacks on almost every street. Anyway, my dad went to the local high school and was part of a normal group of guys, meaning they got into a little bit of trouble here and there. Nothing serious, but enough to get the blood moving, and they often pushed each other with dares. About 10 minutes away from his high school, right up on the shoreline, there's an old abandoned building. I asked if it was still there, and he said it is, although he never went back to see it. From what I understand, it was used as a tuberculosis treatment center for kids at one point. The government set it up and maintained it during an epidemic. Sea air is supposed to help with lung issues, so a lot of kids went there to convalesce and get better. When it started emptying out, the government repurposed it into an asylum. They put a lot of mentally unhealthy people in there, but unfortunately, as most people are aware these days, the treatments for problems like anxiety and depression were pretty severe. It was shut down a few years after it opened due to neglect and abuse, and then abandoned. The government still to this day still owns the property. They never knocked the buildings down. All through high school, my dad and his friends had heard about the asylum, and once they reached senior year, they got into the usual dare match and decided to go out there one afternoon. This was kind of sketchy since the area was regularly patrolled, but one of his friends claimed that he knew a back way in through a hole in the fence. After school, they rode their bikes to the abandoned asylum and hid them in some bushes off the road. The friend then led the group to the fence, everyone ducked in, and they were on the grounds. My dad cleared his throat a lot and seemed reluctant to keep telling his story, but I gave him a little space. I think he really wanted to just get it off his chest after all these years. Eventually, he continued, and told me about how they'd only made it to the first floor ground level when strange things started happening. First, they heard a metal door slam. A lot of the windows had been broken out on the building and it was exposed to the outdoors, so the group stuck together, thinking a random person had just shown up or was waiting around to scare visitors. But as they went in the opposite direction of the sound, peeking into rooms here and there, they started to hear footsteps. The steps were pretty loud in the empty building and hurried. My dad had waited in the hallway outside one room that gave him the heebie-jeebies, as he said. So he was alone when he heard the footsteps rushing toward him. He whirled around and shouted as a shape came at him, flinging his arms up, but no one ran into him, and when he looked, there was no one there. His friends all piled out of the room, freaked out and asked what happened. He told them, and although they made fun of him a bit, everyone agreed to leave quickly after that. The worst part was, he told me, the footsteps didn't stop. The group could hear the sound slowly following them out of the building, and it took everything in my dad not to run. That's one dare they didn't repeat. They were only in the building for maybe 15 minutes, but my dad insists there's no point in exposing yourself to the unknown. As an animal control officer, I've dealt with my fair share of weird phone calls over the years. Nothing will ever top the call I received on August 2nd, 2017, though, because that's the day I came to believe firmly in the beast in question. That morning, when I first got to work, I had a note on my desk from the girl who worked dispatch. She'd scribbled down an address and wrote simply, "Blind woman, big bird." I recognized the address right off, and my mind was officially jogged by the reference to the blind woman. I'd been there a few weeks before because she had a similar complaint. Since the first call, I'd started taking notice when I drove by her house that the old woman spent a lot of time sitting outside on the porch. I guess she liked the fresh air or the sounds of the outdoors. She'd been sitting out every time I had driven by since that first day, and that's where she was the first time I came by too. She had told me then that sometimes when she sits on her back porch, something very large flies close by the house, and that the sound of its wings was very loud and had actually created enough wind to knock a book of Braille poetry out of her hands. I didn't know that I believed the second part, but I did know that certain species of birds of prey can be very large and sound, even bigger than they are to the untrained ear. I searched the property after that first call, but found no sign of anything taking up residency, and told her that more than likely it was a falcon or hawk swooping her yard for a squirrel, and she shouldn't be too concerned. Now, staring at the note, I figured she'd heard it again. You know how sometimes you just know something is about to turn into a bigger ordeal than you want to deal with? That's exactly how I felt at that moment. I had dealt with her once before, and she wasn't happy with my inability to fix the problem. I had no doubt in my mind that she was going to be equally upset when I came back out and had similar results. Still, it's my job, so I got my stuff together and drove over to the house. When I got there, she wasn't sitting on her porch, though, as she usually did. Instead, she was sitting inside the house. It was nearing dusk at that time, though, so I thought maybe she was just avoiding mosquitoes or getting ready to have dinner. She soon let me know I was wrong. That thing swooped back down while I was out on that porch and knocked my book out of my hands again, she told me. I told her that sometimes large birds of prey will patrol certain areas and that it isn't uncommon to see one swoop the same place more than once, but that nothing was living on her property as far as I could tell. It got my cat, she interrupted me. I was stunned, but as sad as it was, there's nothing uncommon about a bird of prey swooping up a pet either. He pulled it off the porch, she said, filling the stunned silence. Now that was something that I couldn't rationalize. As big and fearless as birds of prey are, they rarely risk interacting with people. If she'd been sitting on that porch, there's no way one would have come up and grabbed the cat. I asked her to show me where she had been sitting, and that's when I walked into a gruesome sight. I was glad the old woman couldn't see the blood and fur smeared and splayed across the porch or the deep scratches in the wood from the claws of whatever had grabbed it. I asked her, "Did this thing make a sound, have a smell, anything else you can tell me?" I couldn't imagine what we might be dealing with after seeing the mess it left in its wake. "It smelled like sulfur," she said, "and it was hot. There was heat rolling off of it. It was then that I saw the feathers. 3 or 4 large black feathers stuck out from between the planks of the back porch. I reached down and grabbed them, pulling them free. Each was at least 2 feet long. There's not a bird in the area they could have fallen off of." The old woman asked me, "It's that damn Jersey devil, isn't it?" I could have shrugged her off. I could have assured her to the best of my ability that it wasn't. I could have come up with some other excuse as to what it could have been and saved her the terror. But I couldn't lie to an old woman. I told her that the Jersey devil was the only reasonable explanation and that I didn't think she should sit on her porch alone anymore. A few weeks later, a young man came into the station and asked to speak to me. He introduced himself as the old woman's grandson and said he'd set up a ring camera at her back door, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had been swooping back there. When he showed me the picture on his phone, there wasn't much mistaking what it was. A large black mass and 2 glowing eyes stared into the camera from the middle of the yard, as if it knew the camera was there watching it. I asked him to email it to me, but he never did. A few days later, the house had a for sale sign in the yard, and I never heard anything from those people again. I think I'd have moved too. Last July, I was working in Wexford County, Michigan as a biologist, conducting a study of Michigan native wolf packs to get an accurate idea of their pack sizes and territories around the area. I was living in a trailer near the edge of the woods where I could easily access any of the areas within my study if needed. Inside my trailer, I had a CB scanner to listen in on, hopeful it would give me some guidance on any wolf sightings in the area. The night I saw the dog man, I was just finishing heating up a bowl of macaroni and cheese in the microwave when the scanner called out that someone was hearing wolf howls about a mile east of where I was parked. I decided to forego my dinner and head out that way. One of my usual wolves that I had been tracking had been missing for a couple days, and I was hopeful it would be her. I loaded up my gear and headed toward the address where the report was called in from. When I got there, there were several people standing outside in the yard of a house, staring into the dark field behind the home. I asked if that was where the wolf was heard coming from, and several nodded, but nobody really spoke. They all looked somewhat in shock, as if they'd just witnessed something terrible or otherworldly. I asked one guy that was standing toward the edge of the crowd if he'd seen the wolf and if it was okay. He turned and looked at me with a puzzled look on his face and told me simply that he didn't know what he saw, but that it wasn't any normal wolf. As he said it, the thing howled from back in the field. It sounded like a typical wolf howl, but had a higher-pitched screech to it, almost reminiscent of what you'd expect to hear in old stories about banshees and witches. It echoed over the whole area, and an eerie silence followed. Not even the crickets or frogs were making sounds. The guy standing near me suddenly pulled his phone out of his pocket. It was lit up with a text message from somebody. "They're over there," he said. "They're going to turn on the spotlights." When he said it, two men rushed to their pickups and adjusted spotlights as well. All at once, spotlights lit up the adjacent end of the field as well as our end, and there in the middle of the field stood something I can only describe as being almost werewolf-like. It was hard to tell from where we stood exactly how tall this thing might be, but it looked big. It had a muscular upper body balanced on two short legs, and it was covered in dark fur. There was a long, toothy snout, and its eyes reflected back the light of the spotlights as it looked around, taking in all of its surroundings. It let out another massive, screeching howl, sending many people running to hide in their cars before it took off in a dead run, straight for the crowd I was standing in. There were more people standing across the field than there were standing on our side. I guess it opted for the path of least resistance. As it ran for us, we all moved in a hurry to get out of its path. Nobody wanted to wind up being a meal to a hungry wolf man or werewolf or whatever it might be. I jumped back in my truck, and an older man jumped in along with me on the passenger side. I guess it was just the luck of the draw that I happened to be parked right in the pathway of where this thing wanted to run. He ran straight toward the truck, leaping onto the hood and then scurrying across the roof of the truck and over the bed before disappearing into a darkness behind me. We waited a few minutes to be sure we were safe. Then me and the old man and a few others came back out of our cars to survey the damage. To this day, I'm still driving that truck around with dents and scratches on the hood. It's very clear from the indentations that the foot itself was at least 18 in length, with claws sturdy enough to leave dents that looked like they could have been made with roofing nails. The most bizarre part of it all, though, was the odor. A thick doggy odor hung in the air around us for at least a good hour as we stood around trying to make sense of what we had seen. The dogman was long, but his scent hung in the air as if someone was burning a candle. A few weeks later, I was out at night trying to get a good count on some wolf pups that were on their first hunt when I smelled that odor again. Needless to say, I abandoned my hunt for the pups and made way back to my truck and headed for camp. I wasn't going to risk coming face to face with that creature again. I don't work with wolves anymore. Instead, I accepted a new assignment, keeping track of slugs and snails in the creek beds of Illinois. It's quiet work, but at least my truck's safe. A few years back, when I was out in the Humboldt County area, something happened that made me a believer. This is a pretty remote area of California. It's also beautiful, and a ton of people go missing there every year. I live in Nevada, but my cousin, who I've always been close with, lives in California. In 2012, I was heading to college, so we decided to do a bit of a road trip through Northern California before I had to live in a dorm. My cousin, I'm going to call him Todd for privacy reasons, is no stranger to the northern part of the state. He's a bit of a daredevil and is always trying crazy, risky sports and hobbies. I told him I wanted to keep this trip tame, which he was up for. We were going to do a drive up the famous 101, then hook over to 299. It cuts east through the state, and there's a nice mountainy area I was excited about. At the time, my cousin was driving a really old Nissan. It actually had a hole worn through the floor on the passenger side, and I had to keep my feet a certain way so I didn't accidentally put my foot through it. This was in late summer, and the weather was great. Further north it cools down a bit, so we had the windows down, and my cousin had this epic playlist on. The first few nights we stayed in motels and bumped around towns like Eureka. We met up with two of Todd's friends around there, and they joined us for the drive. At some point, the group of us started telling stories about odd things that had happened to us here and there. I didn't have much to contribute, like I said. I had a pretty tame life growing up. No weird experiences. But one of the girls who was with us, Catherine, seemed really into this stuff. She'd had a few different encounters, as she called them. At first, me, Todd, and the other friend kind of laughed and made fun of Catherine a bit. But after about an hour of chatting on this topic, it was obvious she was getting upset about us not believing her. The mood in the car had also changed, maybe just because it was coming on nighttime. We were on 299, but not too far along it. This was a stretch where it was really woodsy, and Todd spotted a pretty deep pull-off to the right, so we decided to camp out there. I go camping a few times a year and love it, but that night, I was definitely on edge. I thought it was just Catherine's creepy stories. They'd gotten weirder and weirder as she told them. I tried to shrug it off. My cousin and I shared one tent, and the two friends had actually brought hammocks, so they started up a fire to heat up some food while we set up the tent. That night was pretty quiet and uneventful. This is where it gets a little weird. Even writing in, I feel really self-conscious about this part, but I think finally telling someone about it will help me get over it. Late the next morning, the other girl, I can't remember her name, mentioned that there was a waterfall nearby down a little dirt road. It was a popular hiking area, and we decided to stop. There were a few other cars parked there, so nothing felt out of the ordinary. I switched out my sneakers for boots. Everyone grabbed their bags and water, and we started into the woods. It was a beautiful day, but surprisingly dark under the trees. At first, the hike was flat, but soon it started going uphill. Made sense since we were heading for a waterfall. There were a few tight switchbacks, and some of these opened out onto a view. We could see mountains not too far from us and pockets where the woods dipped down. The fog was rising up out of those dips, which is one of my favorite parts of being in the mountains. About half an hour into the hike, we stepped out onto a switchback that was pretty bare. All four of us slowed down to take in the view. There was another, slightly taller and rugged-looking mountain directly across from us. It had some bald spots, rocky faces sticking out through the trees, and it was on one of those rock faces that we saw the figure. At first, Todd thought it was a bear and quietly pointed it out. But soon it was obvious from the way it was moving that this wasn't a bear. It was definitely a person. The girls backed off the trail a bit, and I could tell they were both uncomfortable. I joined them quickly because the figure across the way from us turned, and it was definitely a person, a guy wearing a dark cloak. I don't know how else to explain it, almost like a robe. I couldn't get a good look at his face. It was immediately a weird thing to see in the middle of the woods, and the fact that he looked like he was just waiting for something really freaked me out. Todd was standing near the edge of the switchback, basically holding his breath. I had this horrible feeling that something bad was going to happen if the guy turned and saw us. Luckily, right then, a family with a few young kids came trudging down the trail toward us. Todd had to get out of the way, and it kind of reset the vibe. It was hard to smile and act normal. I almost wanted to point the guy out to them, but glanced back that way and he was gone. We gave it a few minutes after the family passed, and then we all agreed to head back down to the car. None of us wanted to be out in the woods with whatever that was. We made it back in record time, piled in, and flew down 299. No way were we camping in those woods that night. Eventually, Catherine reluctantly started telling another story about something called the Dark Watchers. A few months later, I gave in and looked them up, and I think she might have been right. Definitely seems like what we saw. They're basically beings in the woods who watch travelers, which I guess we were that day. I think my gut had picked up on something because according to the legends, they're relatively harmless until you make eye contact with them. I'm not sure what happens then, but people disappear. That's not unusual for Humboldt County, but it makes me wonder how many of those missing people have encountered Dark Watchers. This is the first time I'm bringing it up to anyone. Only Todd and the girls know what we experienced that day. I guess I could have used it as a freshman icebreaker, but I would have immediately been the weird kid. As freaky as it was, it's good to know that that stuff is out there. I'm a lot more careful now and aware. Thanks again for listening and for getting info like this out there. Last summer, I was canoeing on the Saco River by myself, just to get away for a few days. Sometimes you've got to just clear your head and not hear people's voices, you know what I mean? I'm sure. Although at the end of this trip, I was wishing I'd brought someone with me, just so I'd have someone to back me up, that it really happened. I did have my dog Bo with me, but he's not much good as a witness. It started out pretty pleasant. If you've never been on the Saco, you need to give it a try. There's a lot of sandbars you can just pull your boat up on and pitch a tent. My plan was to find a good spot and stay put there for 2 nights, but I left after the first one. Bo's really good about sticking close to me. He's a black lab. You know they're in heaven around the water. I had been paddling for about a half hour, but I could tell Bo was itching to swim, so I told him okay. I was good to let the current take me downstream for a bit, just using the paddle to keep myself from turning sideways. Bo would swim to the shore and race around, popping out and checking to see where I was. Then he'd jump back in the river and swim near the boat for a bit before doing the whole thing all over again. He was happy as a lark, big, goofy dog grin on his face. At one point, I heard him start barking when he was on land. I whistled and called him, clapping my hands to get his attention. It took a few minutes, but he showed up on the shore. He just sat down and looked at me, which was unusual. I mean, him not swimming out to me. So I thought maybe he's tired, and I paddled into shore. I got out myself to go relieve myself in the woods, but the minute I started to head away from the bank, Bo got all anxious, running around me and barking. I couldn't tell what was going on with him, but he was mighty jumpy. I had to wonder if maybe he'd seen a snake or something. Sometimes a big enough snake will get him acting wild. I just walked over to the nearest tree and did my thing, telling him to calm down. When I started to walk back to the boat, I saw something a little strange on the sand. There were a half-dozen dead fish laying there, with only the bellies eaten out. Kind of strange, because just about any animal I know would eat the head too, even if they left the tail. But these all just had half-moon-shaped bites taken out of them, so I was a little puzzled by that. There weren't too many flies on them yet, so it must have happened fairly recently. After a minute, I just put it out of my head, getting Bo all settled in the boat and shoving off. He seemed content to be just a passenger at this point, sitting in the bow and keeping an eagle-eyed watch on the right-hand bank. We found a good sandbar not long after that, and I was ready to be off the river. I beached the boat and tied it, and Bo jumped out, sniffling around while I unloaded my gear. He was sticking pretty close to me, even though I told him, "Go on, it's okay." Usually when I tell him that he's like a little kid at recess, just runs off to explore. But he hung out with me while I pitched the tent. It was pretty darn relaxing not having anyone around, just me and the river and my dog. That evening I was kicked back by the fire when Bo started acting weird again. He'd ambled over to the riverbank and was standing with his tail tucked down, just whining. I called him a few times, but he wouldn't come, so I finally walked over there to see what was up. I couldn't see a damn thing, staring out at the river in the dark. But then I heard some splashing and it sounded big, not like a fish. That had me wondering if there was a bear nearby. They're pretty good swimmers, you know. I already had my food hung in a tree, but I made Bo come back with me to the fire just in case. He was acting really nervous, and within a few minutes he went to the tent door and just stood there whining. I've got a 2-room tent, and I always have Bo sleeping in there with me. I wondered if maybe he wasn't feeling well that he wanted to go inside so early. It's usually the other way around. I get in there with him and he whines to go back out. I was pretty beat, so I didn't stay up much longer. Bo had laid down right in front of the tent, and he was happy when I joined him. We got inside and settled in, and I fell asleep straight away. I woke up with the light shining in and Bo barking his head off. He looked at me when I sat up and whined, so I unzipped the tent, thinking he had to pee. While I was still getting dressed, I heard a big splash and Bo yelped. Frantic, I stumbled outside without my shoes on because he sounded hurt. And he was. He loped over to me and he had a big scrape down his foreleg that was bleeding. I looked around but couldn't see any threat, so I ducked back into the tent and grabbed my first aid kit and a bandana. Poor baby was trembling all over while I cleaned and dressed his wound, wrapping the bandana over a gauze pad. It didn't look too bad, but I wondered what it could have been. It looked like he'd been clawed, not bitten. Maybe a raccoon, I thought. I went back over to the river and looked out, but I didn't see anything. Still, with my boy getting scraped up, I felt like we better pack it in. He stayed right by my side while I tore down the tent and packed the boat back up, a sure sign he was feeling bad. As I got into the boat with Bo riding in front, I thought I saw something move just beneath the surface of the water, about 15 feet out. Just the way the surface rippled. Strange, but I thought I'd imagined it, so I shoved off. No sooner had I started paddling than I felt the boat bump into something. A log, I thought. But then suddenly we were violently wrenched sideways, almost like something had grabbed us. I turned to look and there was this thing. I don't even know what it was. It was like something out of a B movie. Only part of its head was above the water, less than 10 feet from us. The head was as big as a man's head, but reptilian-looking, all bumpy with scales. It had these big bug eyes, completely black, and it was submerged up to there. I couldn't see the rest of it, but I didn't need to. It was scary as hell. Bo started whining and growling, but kind of hunkered down like he didn't want to be seen, and I had to think maybe this thing was what he'd gotten into a scuffle with. I'll tell you plain, I was scared to death, so I just started paddling hard, getting away from it, wondering how fast the thing could swim. It stayed right where it was, though, thank God, and never came after us. I don't know what the hell that was. I've never even heard of any creature like this. It made me question my sanity. At one point, I had to wonder if it was someone in a rubber mask. But there was no one around. No boats that morning at all. It would ease my mind a little if someone else had seen or heard of this creature, so speak up if you have. By the way, Bo's fine. His cut healed up with no problem. But we're gonna find another river. I've never told anyone about this except for my family. I was driving from Worcester, Massachusetts to Hartford, Connecticut for work. It only takes about an hour and a half, but I was driving at night, and I wasn't too happy about that. I was going to stay in Hartford for a few days at a hotel. I remember my spouse wasn't too happy because we had family coming into town, and I'd missed the first day they'd be in town. I told them there was nothing I could do, and that I'd see them soon, and to apologize to the family for me. I reminded them it wouldn't be too long, and that it didn't take too long to get home. I filled a travel mug with coffee and got in the car. It was around 8 o'clock at night, as I had to work that day before I left. Traffic wasn't too bad at the time, so it wasn't too bad getting out of the city. I took the 290 to the 90 and then jumped onto the 84 going south because that goes all the way through to Hartford. I like driving at night, so it was okay. I had my coffee and I had the radio on, and I just kind of decompressed on the way down. You have to kind of do that, just lose yourself in the driving and de-stress from the day or week. A lot of people don't like the highway, but it's okay as long as you're paying attention. It happened when I was getting close to Nipmuc State Forest. I had been there before, even brought the family there, but we just stopped going after this. It started to rain a little, just like a lazy drizzle, nothing too heavy or anything. I had the windshield wipers on their lowest setting. I saw it when I took a sip of my coffee, 2 small orange orbs just kind of floating in the tree line. I thought maybe it was someone out there with weak flashlights or something. I wasn't sure. When I turned back, something ran in front of my car, and I kind of jumped in my seat and pulled to the side of the road. There was no way I was getting out of the car, especially when I was pretty sure it was just a dog or something, maybe a big raccoon. I didn't see fur, but I did see grayish coloring. I switched to the passenger seat and rolled the window down to at least stick my head out. I see movement near some tall grass, and that's when the thing pops out. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It had like a peanut-shaped head. I couldn't see a mouth or even a nose. It might have had a slight bump where the nose should be, but I'm not positive on that. I definitely didn't see any nostril holes or see any breath in the air. The thing was moving on all fours, on these skinny arms and legs, but it was the fingers and toes. I remember those the best. They were really long, almost tentacle-like, and seemed to really grip the ground when it moved. It moved slowly at first, and it just stared at me. I was frozen in the window. I still don't believe what I saw. I just sat and stared back at it, trying not to move too much. I don't really know what set it off, but it seemed like it heard something in the trees. It turned its head fast in that direction, and then took off like a bullet into the tree line. I almost fell out of the window trying to get a better look. I wanted to get out of the car. I wanted to go off into the woods after it, but something screamed in my head not to do that. I just sat staring at the trees and brush. I couldn't see it moving, but I saw 2 more pairs of eyes. Those orange orbs were its eyes. Then 2 more pairs appeared. That's when I suddenly remembered I had my phone and reached down for it, turned the flash on, and just started taking as many pictures as I could, as fast as I could. They disappeared after a few minutes, and I just leaned back into the car and rolled the window back up. I just sat there, wiping the water off my face, and just trying to figure out what the hell did I just see. I looked at the pictures on my phone, but you can't really tell what it is, you know. It's just a flash of the trees and some pale orange orbs in the woods. It could be anything. I guess I should have hit the zoom or something. I don't know. I just didn't think about it in the rush of things. My mind just went blank, I guess. When I switched back into the driver's seat, about 5 minutes later, a state trooper pulled up behind my car. I rolled down the window when he came up and asked me what was going on. I just told him what I had originally thought had happened, that either a dog or a really big raccoon had run out in front of my car, and I pulled off the road because of it. He asked me if I saw it again when I pulled over, and I said no, it must have run off somewhere. He shined his flashlight in my car, and then told me to be careful on the roadways. I thanked him and watched him drive off. I quickly followed suit and got back onto the freeway. I kept looking back, though, in my rearview mirror, looking at the spot that I had stopped at, looking to see if I could just see anything. My mind wandered the whole time I was in Hartford. I just couldn't seem to concentrate on anything work-related. I just kept remembering what I saw. I even had to question myself if I remembered everything right. I took the same route home, and when I realized where I was, I drove slower than I probably should have, but I kept looking out my windows trying to see anything. Nothing showed up, though. When I got home, it took a while before I told my spouse what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. I'll never forget what I saw. I've traveled that route about 100 times since, but I still haven't seen anything like I did that night. I've never been much of a city person. Too many people around usually makes me feel cramped. I like living a ways out in the boonies. That means I have to drive about 45 minutes to get to work. But I think it's worth it. I've been working in the restaurant industry while I figure out my next move. One night, I got out of work at around 1 a.m. I drove home thinking about how good it would feel to get into bed. I was so tired that as soon as I got home, I parked and got out of my car and locked my keys inside. I couldn't freaking believe it. At least the car wasn't running. It was nice out and we live in a pretty safe neighborhood. I live with my dad and he had to wake up at 6 to get ready for work. I did not want to wake him up. I knew he would be so angry at me for being so careless. So instead, I called AAA to come unlock my car. They said it would be about an hour and a half response time. That was fine. I wasn't really in any rush. By then, I felt wide awake. Like I said, it was nice out. Probably a nice 68 degrees, and it felt good to be out in the fresh air. I climbed onto the roof of my car and laid there looking at the stars. It was such a clear night. After a while, I started hearing the sound of rustling nearby. I didn't give it much thought. I figured it was the wind or maybe one of the neighbors. It was quiet for a bit, and then there was more occasional rustling. I'm listening to this, and then I realized there was no wind. Plus, it's like 2 a.m. Of course, everyone in the neighborhood is either asleep or doing something sensible, like watching a movie like a normal person, instead of laying on top of their car like me. Then I heard what sounded like a rumbling, growling sound. After a few seconds of that, I felt a foreign presence in the area, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. We live at the base of a hogback mountain range in western Colorado, and it's not unusual to get mountain lions around there. I started feeling paranoid. I scrambled up to a sitting position and looked around. The way our neighborhood is set up, we have no houses across the street from us. The front of our house faces the mountain, but there are a couple of really old abandoned outbuildings over there surrounded by pine trees. Once I sat up, I could tell the noise was coming from there. I was straining my eyes to see. We have a streetlight, but it's not the brightest. As I watched, I finally saw something unbelievable come around the corner of the building, along with this amazing stench of musty, wet dog. As I looked at it, I assumed I was just screwed. I was out in the open like a sitting duck. The thing was enormous. I mean, if that old building was about 8 or 9 feet high, this creature was barely shorter than it. It looked like a giant ape with a cone-shaped head. It was covered with really shaggy hair, but not on its face, like long, darkish brown fur. By this time, I had quietly laid back down on the car and was watching it, just kind of looking around. It didn't seem to have seen or smelled me yet. It was just bumbling around, and then it started heading back behind the building. Then I heard this ungodly yelp that scared the heck out of me. I got my phone out of my pocket and made sure it was on silent and took a picture. Then I started calling my dad over and over, hoping he had his phone next to him. He finally answered and was like, "What the hell? What?" I was trying to yell, "Come to the door. I'm locked out. There's a huge creature out here. It hasn't seen me. Come to the door now." If you knew my dad, you'd know he wasn't much less dangerous than that giant thing out there, but I had to take the chance. And so he came to the door. I was so freaking glad he didn't just leave me out there to teach me a lesson or something. As soon as he opened the door, I froze for a second and considered my situation. The beast was behind the building, maybe 60 feet away, and the door to my house was about 30 feet away. Even if it heard me, I'd be able to get to the door and in the house before it got to me. So I bolted to the door faster than I'd ever moved. It must have heard me because when I got to the door, I turned around and saw it come back into view and stare at us. It took a couple steps forward and I slammed the door. I was really terrified at that point, but I was also glad that my dad had gotten a glimpse of it. Otherwise, there's no way he would have believed me, and I would have gotten murdered anyway. We watched through the front curtains for a long time, but it never crossed the street toward us. I guess it wandered off, but I had no idea which direction it went. I made sure to call ATA to tell them not to come. The picture I took is just too dark and murky. I think you can tell something is there, but it's blending in with the trees too much. I'm just a nervous wreck since that happened, and I feel so uncomfortable whenever I go outside. You are probably going to think I am crazy. I think I am crazy, and I lived it. I was on vacation with my spouse. We had decided that we would go to a state that we haven't even traveled to before, and we decided that South Carolina was where it was at. I always loved the idea of the Carolinas. Anyone I talked to always told me how beautiful they were. It was a no-brainer when we decided to go out of our comfort zone and try somewhere new. I didn't expect that trip to completely destroy my view of South Carolina, but it did. I was so excited because normally when we travel, we go to the same places, Dallas, Denver, Albuquerque, and I was ready for a new adventure. So when my spouse said, "Let's go somewhere new," I quickly told them I wanted to go to South Carolina. I wanted the beach and the exciting energy that I always had heard about from friends that had traveled there. They forgot to mention the unnatural creatures that shared the area. We had been in Columbia, South Carolina for a few days, but I was ready to get out of the city and hit some small towns on the way to the beach. I wanted to stay in small hotels along the way and really enjoy our trip. Thankfully, my spouse loves to travel as much as I do and was 100% game to do the touristy thing with me. The first small-town hotel was cute. We had fun eating at the diners in town, shopping, and just taking in the scenery. But all good things come to an end. We moved on to the next town, checked into our room, and went in search of food. By the time we were done eating, it was late-ish. Not quite dusk, but also not night. That perfect time between the two. We were walking back to our hotel, talking about what we wanted to do the next day, and I was trying to convince them that we should go to the antique store that we had passed on our way into town. I was enjoying the walk, and had almost convinced them when we saw movement in the shadows. I wrote it off as just someone walking home. We had never been in this town before, so I didn't know any better. I felt slightly uneasy, but I didn't let it stop me. I was determined to go antique shopping the next day. My spouse and I were laughing as we hit the parking lot of the hotel. However, my laughter quickly stopped when I saw movement again. Something was very, very off. I rushed us into our hotel room, locking the door behind us, my nerves screaming that something was wrong, but I couldn't place the fear. It made no sense. I knew that I wanted out of this town. I let my spouse know that maybe we just move on in the morning, which made no sense. They argued that I had gotten them excited to go to the shop and that we could leave tomorrow night like we planned. I didn't want to fight about it and ruin our vacation, so I agreed, and we headed to bed. I struggled to sleep that night. The next morning I felt foolish. Of course, there would be things I was unfamiliar with in this town. I had never been there. It was all new to me. My spouse and I spent the day trying a new dinner, picking antiques and checking out the little town shops, buying souvenirs and postcards to send ourselves from on the road. I was feeling very comfortable as our day came to an end, and we loaded the car with our suitcases. I was ready to get to the next town, check in, and plan out tomorrow. I had no idea that our trip was about to become memorable for a truly terrifying reason. We had only been on the road for about an hour. We were trying to get close to the beach before we stopped for the night, but not too close because we weren't ready to give up our small town days. The road we were driving down was gorgeous, even in the dark. The trees had grown up tall and their branches reached across the road, making a sort of tunnel. Our headlights were shining against the trees and signs, but that wasn't all. Suddenly they lit up a strange figure. We were out in the middle of nowhere and we were worried that it was someone needing a ride, so we pulled off the road and turned our hazards on. I opened the door and called out. I immediately regretted my choice. The figure had been crouched down, and when it stood, it towered over me. The thing, because it was clearly not human, swung its lizard-like head around to stare at me. My breath caught in my throat, and my spouse started pulling on my jeans to get me back in the car. I jumped back in our car and shut my door. I didn't even have the chance to put our car in drive before the creature was jumping on the hood. The yellow eyes are something I will never forget. My spouse started screaming as the lizard-like thing started scratching its huge claws down the hood of our car. I frantically fumbled our car into gear, slamming on the gas and praying that I can get this thing off of our car before it comes through the windshield. But it just dug its claws deeper into the hood. I slammed on the brakes, which threw the creature onto the ground in front of us. My spouse just said, "Go," and I went. I went around the creature and floored it, getting us as far from the area as I could. We were both shaking as we made it into the next town, but we decided that we were just going to keep going. We didn't want to risk whatever it was finding us again. From now on, I am going to be looking into all of the creepy stories of an area before we decide to travel there. I'm all good on the scary unknown. I've had my fill. This is a story that happened to me almost 30 years ago. Honestly, it's been so long that I nearly forgot all about it. I lived in Philadelphia at the time, but my uncle had a home that he purchased out in Chester County, about an hour away. Every weekend I would beg my parents to let me go stay with him. My uncle wasn't married and didn't have any kids, and he genuinely enjoyed when I would come to visit. Most of the time I would help him with his various projects around his considerable property, or we would go fishing at the small lake that you could see from his back deck. It was on one such of these weekend trips that this story takes place. I was around 6 or 7 when it happened. My dad had dropped me off at my uncle's on Friday after school and would be coming to pick me up on Sunday morning. Me and my uncle just hung out that night eating pizza and watching some scary movies that my parents would never have let me see. The next day after breakfast, my uncle said he had some work to do in the basement and that it would take a while. He said he didn't want me to help him because some of the building materials they used to build the old house might get me sick, so he told me to go outside and play. Times were different then, and his neighborhood, if you could call it that, was very quiet and safe. There were no other neighbors nearby, really, and the only other house in sight was a really old ramshackle house across the lake. So I was messing around outside for about a half hour when I saw somebody standing down by the lake. It was a few hundred feet down from the house, and there was a dirt path that led from the back of the property to the shoreline. The figure waved to me to come down, and not knowing any better, walked down to meet them. The person waiting for me by the lake was an extremely old woman. Granted, when you're a kid, everyone seems old. I couldn't tell exactly, but she was probably one of the oldest people I have ever seen. And this is where things got hazy. I have a vague memory of the woman telling me she had lots of nice toys on the other side of the lake and she wanted to take me to see them. But in order to get there, we would have to walk across the lake. Finally, I remember her holding my hand. The next thing I have a concrete memory of is my uncle holding me and walking with me back up the trail to the house, my clothes soaking wet. He was asking me why I was standing in the lake, and he seemed kind of upset at me. We got to the house and my uncle got me a change of clothes and let me get dressed. When I was done, he was waiting for me at the table and asked me to explain myself, so I did. He let me finish my story, listening very intently as I told it. When I was done, he asked me questions about the old lady, only I couldn't really remember any details about her at all. It was weird because she was literally right next to me, but it was like trying to recall any specific features about her pushed the memory farther away. After all that, my uncle told me that he came out of the house to check on me and saw me standing about 10 feet into the lake, the water almost above my shoulders. There was no old lady. My uncle decided to pause his project and we spent the rest of the day just hanging out. My parents picked me up the next day and that was the end of it. I went back a bunch more times but never saw the old woman again. My uncle didn't really let me out of sight either, though. So why am I telling this story now? My uncle is one of those guys blessed with eternal youth. 30 years later and he still has enough energy to swing a hammer and dig in his garden. And now I'm a father myself, my son having recently turned 7 years old. The memories of that day having long receded, I decided it would be good for my son to get out of the city and spend some time with my uncle. My son had been there twice, but never without me, and never for an entire weekend. So, we made the arrangements. Friday after school, I dropped him off to spend the weekend with my uncle, just as I had when I was a kid. I talked to him the next morning, and all seemed well, and I told him I would call him again later. I got a call from my uncle at around 5 p.m. He assured me that my son was fine, but I needed to come and pick him up right now and he would explain when I got there. I made the 90-minute drive in just under 50. When I got there, I could instantly see that my son was indeed okay, and he told me that he wanted to stay. My uncle told me to step outside with him so we could talk. See, a few years after my incident at the lake, my uncle had heard a legend from a local that he became friends with. The local had told him that early in the 1940s, a family used to live in that old abandoned house across the lake. A husband and wife, and their son of 10. When World War II broke out, the husband was drafted and ultimately died on Omaha Beach. The woman was now alone with her son and was suffering from the death of her husband. Over the following year, her mental health deteriorated rapidly, and at one point, a span of weeks had passed without anyone seeing either her or her son. When the local sheriff went to go check on her, he found both her and her son's bodies floating in that same lake. Bloated and waterlogged, they had been there for weeks. The son's hands and legs had been tied with thick rope. The investigation never turned up any clues as to how they had died in the lake. My uncle told me all of this, and then told me why he had called. Earlier that day, he had sat down on the couch for a few minutes just to rest, and had accidentally fallen asleep. My son, being too kind to wake him, decided to go outside for a little bit and entertain himself. My uncle said he suddenly woke up in a panic. He couldn't explain why. After seeing my son wasn't in the house, he went out the back door onto the deck to find him. He spotted him wading into the lake, the water already at his chest. He raced down to the water and dove in just as my son dipped below the surface. He was able to pull him back to shore. He said my son was dazed, like he wasn't really there, but after taking him back to the house and drying him off, my son slowly came around. And he asked my son what had happened. My son told him the same exact story I had almost 3 decades ago, that an old woman had beckoned him to the lake's edge, took his hand, and walked with him into the water. There wasn't much else to say to each other. Not in the mood for speculation or conversation, I simply just sat beside my son for a good while, until I decided that we should get home. I never asked him about the incident, and he never offered anything up, almost like had forgotten it. My son hasn't and won't be going back to my uncle's house. It's not his fault, of course. He is a wonderful guy, and I don't hold any of it against him. It's just, whatever we experienced, whatever that lake or that lady is, it's unnatural. Ghost, demon, entity, I don't know. I'm only sharing this story as a warning to other parents. Something sinister exists in the world, something evil and wretched. Just be safe and keep your children close. This happened about 15 years ago now. I was right around 9 or 10 years old. I was camping with my family in eastern Kentucky. We would go camping together a couple of times each summer when the weather permitted. One of the campgrounds we would go to was on the backside of the mountains. I never liked that particular campground very much. Since we were on the eastern side of the mountains, sunset would come on early, and then all of a sudden it was pitch black out. As a kid, this meant less time to run around the woods with my siblings. My parents were always very strict about having us back at the tent by dark. I can't remember the name of the park offhand. I do remember that all the campsites were hike-in only, meaning we had to park the car at one of the lots inside the park and carry all our camping gear a few miles down the trail to the campgrounds. There were vault toilets at the campgrounds, but no showers or running water, and definitely no electricity, so we had to carry in everything. The hike to the site felt unnecessarily long and grueling to me, but I was only a kid at the time. I'm sure it wasn't more than a couple of miles from the parking lot. We got there on a Friday night after my parents both got home from work, and we planned to stay until Sunday afternoon. Nothing nefarious happened the first night, but I distinctly remember having a strange feeling around the campground. There was a change in the atmosphere from the last time we were there. You know how you can feel a storm coming on before it hits? It was like that, but it wasn't a storm. It was like I could just feel that there was something evil out there in the hills. The days were seemingly normal. Nothing odd happened, but then the sun went down. I'm certain it was out there on Friday when we got to the campground, but it moved in Saturday after nightfall. We were all sitting around the fire eating dinner when a sound came ringing out of the woods. It was metallic in nature. It sounded like someone was banging against a pan or something, and then it transitioned into a metallic scraping sound. My dad took a walk around the campground. There were only 3 other people there, and they all heard the sound too. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the campground, it was coming from the forest. My parents told us to stay close to the campsite for the rest of the night. They thought there was another person out there in the woods, and you really never know with people like that. There have been stories about campers being attacked by crazy people before. I know it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. However, this situation wouldn't be so easily explained. We heard the metallic sound a couple more times before we eventually went to bed. I could tell my parents were on edge, and they made us promise to stay inside our tent until morning. I should mention here that whenever we went camping, my parents would have their own tent, and my sisters and I would sleep in a separate tent. Our tent was actually bigger than theirs, so we never complained. Plus, we liked the extra freedom we thought we had, even though our tents were only about 8 feet apart. My youngest sister woke me up at around 3 in the morning, saying there was someone outside our tent. I told her it was probably one of our parents checking on us, but she said no. She said it was crawling on the ground. The wall of the tent was a little bit see-through, but not enough that you could get a good idea of what was happening outside. The moon that night was full, but it still wasn't enough light to be able to see through the tent wall. Still, I knew my sister wasn't lying. I asked if it was a person, and she said yes, but there was something wrong with it. I remember she used the word it. She didn't say them. She said it. I stayed up with her for maybe 30 minutes before she fell back asleep. I realized that I really needed to go to the bathroom. It would be morning in a couple of hours, but I didn't think I could hold it. I probably should have woken up my other sister and made her come with me, but the toilet was only about 40 feet from our tent, so I grabbed the flashlight and headed out into the darkness. It would only take a minute. I looked around for signs of the person my sister thought she saw, but I didn't see any. I made it to the toilet without any incident, but on my way back, I felt that same feeling as I did on Friday night. Like there was a storm coming. And then I heard a click. It was coming from the forest, not too far from where I was standing. It was an unnatural sound that made me pause for a moment. Looking back, That is exactly what it wanted. The sounds it makes, it wants to confuse you. It wants you to stop and try to figure it out. It wants you to stay there. I knew I needed to get back to the tent ASAP. I didn't want to turn and run in case that made whatever was out there want to chase me, so I calmly turned around and began to walk away. It was then that I heard my name being called from the forest. It almost sounded like my mother's voice, but there was something off about it. And here's the weird part. It was my full name. No one in my family ever calls me that, even if I get in trouble. I always go by my nickname. Always. I turned back around to face the forest and I saw two glowing eyes staring back at me. I couldn't see what they belonged to, but I knew it was something evil. I don't know how it knew my name, but I knew it was trying to keep me there. This time I ran. It didn't take me long to reach the tent, and it didn't appear that the creature attempted to follow me. I didn't get out of the tent until well past morning. I ended up telling my parents what happened on the car ride home. I thought they would be mad at me for leaving the tent after dark, but they were quiet. I don't know if they knew something more about what was out there than I did, but I was afraid to ask. They never took us back to that campground again. For the better part of my 20s, I've lived deep in the forests of Washington. Between the lush woods and the lively coast to the west, each year it feels as though dozens of locals come forward with some tale about a cryptid encounter. But real or not, cryptids are an interesting personality trait of Washington, and one of the main reasons I haven't moved closer to the city of Seattle, which I dearly love. Each Thursday evening, I find myself excited to attend the Cryptid Council weekly meeting, where individuals come to share their encounters, and every so often we plan trips to the locations of recent sightings. One particular Thursday, the day before Halloween actually, an elderly woman attended our meeting in shambles after claiming to have encountered a Sasquatch-like figure just hours before that afternoon. You should have seen the way we, my friends in the council and I, sprung to our feet. Never had an encounter been reported to the group so quickly, and it just so happened we were itching to have an outing over the holiday weekend. In no time, we each made the executive decision to call out of work the following day and scramble home to pack our bags and head out before it got too dark. Our destination, really just an extension of this woman's backyard, was about 40 minutes away from my house. So, by the time we had made it into the woods and set up our camping equipment, the sun was nearly set. Now, by no means were any of us jumping at the opportunity to take part in a camping trip where we actually thought something scary would show face. After all, nothing like that had ever happened before, so what gave us reason to believe it would now? It was more so an excuse for the four of us guys to eat junk food, drink cheap whiskey out of flasks, and tell ghost stories around a portable fire pit. A boys' weekend, if you will. So as you can imagine, come about 2 a.m. when we were all awoken by the most guttural yelping we've ever heard, we were taken aback. In situations like that, you don't spend a significant amount of time being groggy and waking up. It's like your instincts shoot along your spine, and we were all immediately on high alert. Tony was the first to say what we were all thinking when he asked, "What the hell was that?" Standing up from the ground, the wind caught my nose, carrying with it the most foul stench of urine and bee. I quickly assessed our immediate surroundings and, having not seen anything, made quick work of smothering the remaining ashes of our fire as to minimize our visibility. Before any of us had the opportunity to ask anything else or conjure a possible response to Tony's question, a series of deafening whooping noises filled the air, chilling us to the bone. Charlie was the first of the group to sprint away, and none of us had to say a word. We were all right behind him with no hesitation. After about 30 seconds of running, we came barreling into the back door of the elderly woman's home, who'd left the door unlocked in case we needed to use the restroom in the middle of the night. We quickly locked the door, pulled the blinds, and each staged ourselves at the various windows lining the backside of the house to peek outside. When the woman appeared at the top of the stairs asking us what was going on, we quickly hushed her and turned our attention back to the outdoors. And that's when it stepped into view, emerging like a giant even amongst the towering trees surrounding it. This thing must have been every bit of 11 feet tall, with dark brown fur covering it head to toe, minus its bare face. It walked on two legs, almost like an ape, but there was something humanoid about it too, like a Neanderthal with beady eyes and a projecting mouth. We were all frozen in place and didn't dare to make a sound from within the house. I was certain that if we did, and this thing wanted to, it would have easily busted through the back door. Realistically, it must have stalked around the backyard for only a minute or so before vanishing into the woods from which it came, but truth be told, it felt like an eternity watching it. At the first sign of the coast being clear, we all huddled upstairs as to make the least noise as possible and called 911. When the cops arrived and we were cleared to evacuate the property, the woman was taken to a local motel for the foreseeable few nights, and the boys and I packed back into my Jeep and hightailed it back to my house, a much safer 40 minutes away. The police never got back in contact with any of us after that night, leaving my friends and I to believe nothing was uncovered regarding whatever it was we saw in that backyard. But after that, we never participated in a cryptid council outing again. Of course, the group ragged on us for returning with one heck of a story, but no picture to support our case, but we didn't care. We all know what we saw that night, even if it's not something we could explain away with words. It all started when I decided to take a walk a few weeks ago in the middle of the night. I was in Mississippi near Meridian City. I enjoy walking through nature at night to see the wildlife in the area. It is peaceful to walk at night. No one else is around. You see more when you are alone. I think I walked about 7 miles until I saw a bridge built on top of a river. I thought this would be a great place to take a few pictures to add to my Instagram. I set up my phone on the bottom of a beam and I got into position. I had my flash on, and after it went off, I went to go look at the pic. When I looked at the picture, I could see a light in the background. It wasn't a very big light, but still there was a light. I didn't think much of it. I saw some fireflies on the trail I took, so I assumed it was one close to the camera. I took a few more pictures and then looked around to make sure I didn't leave anything behind. My eyes scanned towards the beam where my phone was, and I saw a glowing light, this time closer. I took a closer look at it, and this is where my friends think I am seeing things. I swear I saw a woman sitting at the end of the bank. It was dark out, so I couldn't see her well, but there was a woman just sitting there. She looked like she was crying, hands on her face and everything. I wasn't completely heartless. I walked over to the river and turned on my phone's flashlight so I could see where I was stepping and made my way over to her. I got over to where she was, and as I got closer and shined the light on where she was sitting, she was gone. I thought this was creepy, but again I knew the mind can play tricks on you when you are tired and paranoid, so I chalked it up to me being tired and started to head home. When I got to my car, though, there she was again. She wasn't crying anymore, and she wasn't alone either. She had a man with her and they were arguing. I didn't want to get involved in another couple's drama, so I started my car and turned on my headlights. They were gone. I really started to get creeped out, so I left the parking lot and started my GPS to go home. I drove back to my apartment and decided to sleep that night off. I felt like I needed to sleep anyway since it was later than I was used to, and I did walk for a while. So I went to bed and set my alarm for the morning. When I woke up in the morning, I started to look through my gallery and post the pics I took last night. I saw the one with the light again. I scrolled past it and then I saw something that made my heart stop. I saw a picture with the man I saw in the background. Keep in mind, I only ever saw the woman on the riverbank when I was at the bridge. No one else was around. He had some sort of lantern and he was wearing some sort of suit. What I'm trying to say is he didn't dress like other people. The creepy part is he looked right at me. He didn't smile, didn't wave, nothing. He just stared at me, just standing there glaring at me. I was getting very creeped out at this point, but I was curious to see what other pictures I had taken. Now this is going to be very anticlimactic for some of you, but there was nothing else in any of the other pictures. No one else but me was in them, and that made me very uncomfortable. I sent a text to some of my other friends and showed them the pictures I took. I sent the one with the guy in the background, and they said I must have not been paying attention and some old man was walking around the same time I was. I told them I was completely alone and I was sure of it. And then they started mocking me, asking me if I needed to get my eyes checked or if I needed a hearing aid because I was obviously blind and deaf. I quit answering the texts because at that point, they were just making fun of me and they started saying I photoshopped the guy in the back to prank them. I decided I was going to go back and try to find any sign of someone else being there that night. I didn't have time to go back there at night because some people probably would have walked on the bridge during the day and I wasn't going to get any clear answers if I waited. So I drove back to Meridian and walked the trail again. I saw my footprints were the only ones on the trail still. I made it back to the bridge. Before I stepped on it again, I took a picture to show my footprints were the only ones there. I sent that pic to my group chat, and they told me to quit photoshopping people in the background. I looked up and yet again, there was no one there. But when I looked at the picture I took, I could faintly see the man again, this time walking towards the bridge. After I saw him, I didn't want to look around and I started to walk away. I felt something was watching me and I made it back to my car. Nothing else came from those 2 days. I just have been really paranoid ever since, and my friends went to the same bridge. They told me they didn't see anything or anyone who matched the pictures I sent. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and grew up in more of a city setting to rural Maine is a big change for me. A few years ago, I got my gun permit and a hunting license, and I regularly join my brothers-in-law for seasonal hunting trips. They're both big on turkey and deer. I could go without either, but my spouse grew up on venison, so I always bring some back for her after a hunt. Plus, it's nice to not have to buy a grocery store turkey around Thanksgiving. So late last September, we were gearing up for a turkey hunt and planning on camping overnight for 2 days to scope out a valley area. My brother-in-law Teddy was familiar with this area and got permission from the landowner to hunt there. We took my other brother-in-law Josh's truck to a logging road to park and hike in. I personally love the hiking side of hunting and always get behind just looking at the scenery. Maine is a gorgeous state, especially as far north as we are. It can be desolate and wild, but overall, it's beautiful. We hiked into the camp about 6 miles and were situated on the rim of the little valley, which didn't drop too far down but created a bowl shape. We were in a nice spot near a lookout where, early the next morning, we'd be able to see down into the valley and watch for any turkey movements. Once we were settled in, it was a little after noon and we weren't planning on much other than checking our gear, having a few beers, starting dinner and winding down. The plan was to get up a little after 3 a.m., so sleep is pretty important on these trips. Teddy was sleeping in a hammock, but Josh and I both had pup tents. We got those set up our camp chairs, and were just hanging out. After about 2 hours, the 3 of us took off into the woods to get enough firewood for the 2 nights we'd be staying. Teddy and I stayed closer together, but Josh wandered a little further, wanting to keep an eye out for turkey trails. I had a solid armful of logs and was walking back maybe 200 feet behind Teddy when I saw him freeze. I've never seen a grown man stiffen up like that, even in serious situations, and I'm a linesman by trade, so I've seen some stuff. Teddy went completely still, all 6'1" of him, and I paused, not sure what he'd found. Of course, you hear horror stories of hunters finding decomposing bodies, and that was my first thought. Stepping carefully to be quiet, I think in reaction to the fact that he hadn't shouted or anything and wasn't moving, I came up behind him. He heard me and turned, his eyes wide. I immediately knew to be quiet too, and looked to where he'd been staring. In front of us was a huge sleeping creature. At first I thought we'd stumbled on a grizzly bear, but there aren't actually grizzly bears in Maine, so I knew that couldn't be right. But this thing was huge. Easily twice the size of the average black bear we have around here. It was curled up the way dogs curl up to sleep and had its face tucked into the rest of the body. It couldn't be a black bear though, because the hair was a copper red-brown and really dense, almost matted. Black bears can get a dark brown or cinnamon color, but I'd never seen a bear this color before and had the same reaction as Teddy as reality set in. This just couldn't be a bear. I ran through a short list of other possibilities in my mind, but Teddy was already backtracking quietly. He put his logs and kindling down at some point, and I followed, also trying to be quiet. A few minutes away from our camp, both of us out of breath from adrenaline, we heard a gunshot. It was incredibly loud, and we both jumped, then ran toward camp, knowing it could only be Josh. When we arrived, he was huddled near his tent and pointing a handgun at the ground. "What did you just shoot?" I asked him, starting to panic in case a bear or moose was going to come at us. Handguns aren't usually enough to stop them, but he said he'd shot up into the sky, at an angle. Teddy took the gun from him, and with my ears still ringing, I looked around. The campsite was completely ransacked. Josh's tent was bent sideways and mine was upside down, a few feet from where I'd pitched it. Teddy's hammock had been pulled down out of the tree, and the rope was ripped clean through and frayed. The campfire was scattered, and our things were everywhere. "Just get the guns and ammo," Teddy said, and we scrambled to the shotguns. I also grabbed my hiking bag, which was pretty emptied out. The three of us took off on the trail back to the logging road right away. We only had a few hours of daylight. Once we'd caught our breath and were steadily working back toward the truck, I asked Josh what he'd been shooting for. He explained that when he'd gotten back to the camp, there was something in it. A bear, he thought at first, and he could see it thrashing our stuff around, but then he got a good look and realized it had an ape-like face. Concave, without a snout, and with human-like ears. It completely freaked him out, so he shot once into the air and the thing took off with a kind of hooting or whooping sound. I was going to mention the thing Teddy and I had found sleeping, but Teddy got to it first. We both admitted to not seeing the thing's face, but we were both sure it hadn't been a bear. We spent the last hour of the hike in silence, each trying to figure out what we'd seen. We never told our wives and just said that it wasn't an ideal time or place for a turkey hunt, blowing off their questions. It only comes up when the three of us get together and have a drink, usually, but we still don't know what we saw. Josh puts the creature he saw at well over 7 feet tall. He and his brother are both over 6 feet, and insists it had an ape-human face. The only thing I've come up with is that we must have been in Bigfoot territory. Teddy thinks that's ridiculous, but he's never had a better answer. The three of us still go out hunting, but not on overnight trips anymore, and we keep a wider array of guns on us. Usually we go in groups of 5 to 8 too, just in case. Since I'm not as attached to hunting as my brothers-in-law are, I've been thinking about giving it up. I have no idea if the things we saw in the woods were aggressive, but I don't like what they did to our camp in the minutes we were gone. I grew up in New England, and as you're probably aware, there are plenty of legends up there. Most of them I never took seriously, like Sleepy Hollow or stories about old people hibernating through winter in the snow. There was a state park I lived near and used to frequent a lot, as did other kids my age. It was where we went to hang out. I was 15 when this happened, and would go out with friends and just sit in their cars and gossip or play dumb games, that kind of thing. Nothing too serious, but we'd stay out pretty late. This was back before cell phones were common, so we had no way to get in touch with our parents if anything happened. Luckily, nothing ever really did. One night in August, right before school started, my friend Sherry and I took her car out to the state park and pulled up into one of the parking areas to a spot near a pond. The park has a river running through it that's associated with the devil, but again, I'd never taken this seriously since it was just a story I grew up with. Sherry and I spent maybe 20 minutes talking about the prom coming up. It was autumn and cold for New England. The car's windows fogged up a bit from how warm we were, and we were very focused on our conversation. I had my seat, the passenger seat, kicked back so I could look at the car's roof. Sherry was sitting up a little more than I was because she'd grabbed some fast food on the way here and was eating. There was a lull in the conversation, and out of the corner of my eye I saw her freeze. I looked over and she was holding the fountain drink up but not moving. "Are you okay?" I asked her, thinking maybe she was sick from the food. We didn't eat out a lot and junk food could get dicey. Sherry looked scared and shushed me but didn't explain. My body locked up as I realized something was wrong. It took everything in me not to sit straight up and see what she was looking at. After a minute, she relaxed and told me, "I think someone's dog got loose and is walking around outside." We had a dog growing up that had wandered off a few times, so I always felt bad about these situations and suggested we should get the dog and bring it home. But Sherry shook her head and told me no. It didn't look like it had a collar on, she told me, and it was big. I waited for a second before asking her more questions about the dog because she seemed really freaked out. That was weird to me because Sherry wasn't afraid of dogs normally. But being out in the park at night could be freaky, and it was a little windy, so maybe she was just nervous. Now that I was sitting up, I could look outside. I had to rub the fog off the windows but didn't really see much except for empty picnic tables and a dark area where the river was. Maybe a few 100 feet from our car, a covered bridge crossed the river. Crossing it took you to trails in the woods. Sherry had calmed down a little bit and we were talking about life again when I caught movement near the bridge and turned my head. I saw the dog and at first was ready to open the car door and call to it. But I stopped when I realized something was off. The dog was really big, like bigger than a German shepherd, and it was black, almost impossible to see in the dark. The moon wasn't full, but it was bright enough that we could see the dog's silhouette as it moved around near the picnic tables. Sherry locked the car's doors as it came closer, but the sound of the locks drew its attention, and it turned its head toward the car. Sherry turned the car on, and the headlights hit the dog. It was huge, easily able to look into the windows if it came any closer, and it had a big, blocky head, kind of like a pit bull but with a longer snout. I could see that Sherry was right and it wasn't wearing a collar. She put the car in reverse, but I told her to wait a second. The dog wasn't moving closer, and I wanted to get a better look at it since it looked so strange. I realized as it was looking at us that its eyes were different. Most animals' eyes will catch light at night, but the dog's eyes were red, like actual red, which I'd never seen before. The whole body was completely black, and it had a long, thin tail. Sherry said she didn't want to wait and reversed the car. She hit the speed bumps hard heading out of the park, and I kept checking the side mirror to see if the dog was following us. It didn't, but after that, I was never really comfortable at the park at night. I'd go during the day for parties or picnics, or sometimes with my family, but I always looked for the dog. I haven't been back in over a decade now. Sherry and I lost touch after high school, but that night I felt very close to her. I've had my suspicions for a while about a dog man or a werewolf here in Somerset County, Maine, but it wasn't until recently that I actually saw it. I live on a farm on a few acres of land, and my only neighbors are to the northeast about a mile down the road. It's pretty desolate out here, and there's not much to do except hike, hunt, and fish. This particular day, I decided to go fishing out at the riverbank. I was only out there for like an hour, when all of a sudden I heard a howling. Now, in the modern day, there aren't many wolves in Maine, but it's not exactly unheard of. They are few and far between, and the ones that do pass through here are usually traveling from Canada. Coyotes are usually the ones howling out here, but they have a more high-pitched sound than whatever this thing was. The howl was low and guttural and carried on for like a full minute. Now, I'm sure I was the only one who heard it because I was really out in the middle of nowhere. It sounded pretty close and like I'm not an expert on these things, but I figured it was better for me to be on the move than to come face to face with it. So I started to pack up my equipment and be on my way back to the house. As I was walking, I kept hearing it, and it was really getting loud now. I thought to myself that maybe it was a loose dog and followed me to get some food, but even the largest of the beagles and bloodhounds don't howl that loudly. There's just no way. I started picking up the pace, and when I got into the house, I slammed the door behind me. My walls are pretty thin, but I didn't really hear any more howling after that, so I figured I'd just clean my fish and start on dinner. I was laughing to myself and flying some oil as the sun started to set. I had my meal and then sat down with my book and my lazy boy. I was starting to doze off in all honesty when I suddenly heard a growling sound from outside. I put my book down and looked over at the window. The lights were on, on the porch, and I could see clear as day this beast staring back at me through the screen door from the steps. The only thing between me and this creature was a thin sheet of mesh as I left the door open to allow the breeze to come in. I was terrified and tried to stay as still as possible. At this point, it was on all four legs and just looked like a massive wolf. I could see its dark gray-black hair standing up in spiky tufts on its back, and its head was dipped low. I shifted my weight in my seat, and the thing started to stand up. The porch only has 2 steps, and as it crept up them, it moved itself onto 2 legs. The thing was over 8 feet tall, and its head was a huge mass of fur with a long snout. My eyes were glued on its row of huge, snarling teeth, and I held my breath as it continued to move closer and closer. The creature looked into each of my 2 porch windows, first the left and then the right, before centering itself back at the front door. It just sat there, like a Doberman waiting for supper, and sniffed a deep breath right at the mesh door. As it pulled its nose away, a drop of drool was left on the wire. I couldn't believe my eyes. If it wanted to, it certainly could have scratched and broken right through the door. Even if the door was closed, those powerful claws could have certainly done some damage on the wood frame. It just sat there, though. It just looked at me and sat there. Damn, I do think I was lucky, because who knows what would have happened if I tried to run or fight it. I think my freeze instinct certainly kicked in, and I just waited it out. Eventually, a white-tailed deer started across the lawn. I could see about 20 feet away, and I definitely spotted it before the wolf thing. But as it walked by, the wolf lifted its snout into the air and took a whiff of the air. In an instant, it raised up onto its 2 hind legs and jumped into the air. I heard a squeal from the deer and the sound of gnashing and gnawing. I quickly grabbed a poker from the fireplace and armed myself. When I looked back outside, however, the creature and the deer were gone, leaving just a puddle of blood on the lawn. I definitely couldn't sleep that night, and for the next few days, I stayed over at my brother's house. I'm really terrified to go back to my farm. That thing is definitely out there, and I worry that next time I won't be so lucky. I certainly would have ended up like that dew. I hope I never see that thing again, but if I ever go missing, I just want the world to know that it was this wolf creature out here. I worked at a coffee shop for a while, and it was a chill job. You got to meet all kinds of people, and most of them were excited to get their coffee. It was a 9-to-5 type of job, and I had all sorts of jobs with crazy hours, so the normalcy was refreshing. Every single day for the past year, our first customer of the day was this man named Larry. He was always in a rush and always got a black coffee. Occasionally I could get some pleasantries out of him, but most of the time, he just stared bloody daggers at me until I got him his coffee. It got to the point where we would open about 5 minutes early and have his coffee ready for him so we could hand it through the window. He would often grab the coffee, pay, and leave without saying a word. He was a very strange individual, but he always made me laugh. He wasn't the biggest fan of human interaction, but he sure did love his coffee. He always had a very serious and wide-eyed expression on his face, and I never saw him smile. Then one day he just stopped showing up. I would still open the shop up about 5 minutes early out of habit, but he stopped coming altogether. I began to wonder what happened to him. Did he move? Did he start getting his coffee somewhere else? Did I somehow offend him? After about a week, I started looking into it a little bit. All I knew was his first name, Larry, but I was determined to figure out what happened. He wasn't the biggest talker, but I knew if I could just talk to him, he would let me know why he stopped coming. I searched Larry and filtered for our city on Google, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. I couldn't find anything at all. I eventually just figured he had moved, and I tried not to think about it. About a month went by, and I saw Larry's black car coming through the drive-thru again. It was much later in the day than I usually saw him, and he had a smile on his face, something I never thought I'd see. I was excited to see him, even though we'd barely even spoken before. I asked him if he wanted his usual, and he asked what his usual was. I kind of laughed because the man ordered the same thing at the same time for an entire year. I told him that he always got a large dark roast coffee, and he said he'd like a green tea. I sort of joked with him that he was switching it up a little, and he laughed and laughed. His laugh seriously disturbed me. My joke wasn't that funny, and he had tears streaming down his face in a deep, bellowing laughter. He kept laughing harder and harder, and he stared directly into my eyes the whole time. I nervously laughed along, but something wasn't right. This wasn't the Larry I knew, and at this point, his laughter and his face had me fearing for my safety. I politely waved him on and closed the window, but he stayed by the window leaning toward me. He was laughing so hard that he was spitting all over the window. His eyes looked different. I couldn't see the white in his eyes at all anymore, and I wondered if he was having a stroke or something. I picked up the phone to call the police when he just sped off. It was seriously disturbing. My coworkers all asked what the hell was wrong with Larry, but when I told them what happened, they just kind of laughed it off. But I was freaked out. I finished my shift and headed to the grocery store to get something to cook for dinner. When I got out of the store, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black car. I really didn't want to believe it was Larry's car, so I just got in my car and headed home. Sure enough, the black car pulled up right behind me and started following me. I looked in the rearview mirror, and it was Larry with his black eyes and a huge, creepy smile. I was seriously freaked out, and I just sort of pretended not to see him and kept driving down the road. Every turn I took, he closely followed. I eventually just started driving randomly and erratically to see if he kept following me. Without hesitation, he closely followed every turn I made. I eventually called the police and told them that a regular customer of mine was now stalking me, and he seemed incredibly dangerous. They asked me what my car looked like and told me to drive straight to the police station. I did as they asked, and as soon as I pulled into the station, Larry took off down the road. I thanked the officers, and they told me I couldn't get a restraining order against him unless I had some undeniable evidence that he was stalking me. I felt helpless but figured that the worst was over, and I headed home. Waiting in the parking lot of my apartment building was Larry in his black car with a terrifying smile on his face. His mouth was huge, and his eyes were pitch black. I drove by and went to sleep at my parents' house that night. The next morning at work, I was freaking out that he might be there to get his coffee or green tea, but I didn't see him. I was incredibly relieved, and I went on as if nothing had happened. When I got to my apartment, there were hundreds of completely full coffee cups from the shop that surrounded my bed. It was as if he'd saved every single cup he'd bought from me and not had a single sip from any of them. I had my parents help me move out of there immediately, and I quit my job at the coffee shop. The only thing I can figure is that Larry was possessed by a demon, based on his facial expression, behavior, and eyes. I haven't had any experiences with him since, but I'm living in constant fear that I might see him again. When I was a teenager, I worked at a restaurant that was in an old farmhouse. The bartender, the busboy, and the owners had all told me that the house was haunted, and even some of the longtime diners had stories about encounters with the ghost that supposedly lived there. The odd thing was that the ghost didn't seem to want to scare anyone. It tried to be helpful. A missing kitchen tool would suddenly appear on the counter in plain sight. A misplaced set of keys would show up under the diner's table after 3 different people had looked in that spot. A kid would suddenly be holding a toy that no one recognized. There were tons of stories like that, and everyone thought of the helpful ghost like a mascot for the restaurant. One day, when I had gone into work early to do some deep cleaning, I broke the cardinal rule: never go into the basement fridge without letting someone know you were headed that way. The interior lever on the door was tricky, and if the door slammed shut behind you, you were stuck until someone released the door from the other side. Additionally, the basement had very limited cell service. So there I was, completely alone in the place, which was not out of the ordinary. I often went in during off hours for deep cleaning and prep work. I realized that we were out of lemons in the kitchen, so headed downstairs to grab some. My boss never needed to know I had gone downstairs without a buddy. Big mistake. When I opened the door to the fridge, I sent the block that we used to prop the door open skidding across the floor. Without thinking, I went after it and heard the door slam behind me. I immediately knew that I was in trouble. Not only was it super cold in there, but my boss was also going to be super upset with me. She reminded us constantly that we needed to go to the fridge in pairs. I checked my cell phone. No surprise, but I had no signal. I then got to thinking about how it would be several hours before anyone else showed up, and even longer before someone realized I was missing or headed downstairs for supplies. I thought through my options, which were zero. I just had to wait it out, freezing in my t-shirt and shorts. My teeth started chattering. It was really cold. I started pacing to keep myself warm, occasionally holding my phone over my head to check for a signal. I only needed one bar, but none ever appeared. On what seemed like my 200th lap of the fridge, I had my back to the door when I heard the distinctive thunk of the door handle being pushed from the outside. I whirled around, expecting to see my angry boss or a confused coworker, but there was no one. But the door was swinging open. I dashed out of the fridge into the hallway that led to the stairs. I looked around and called out but didn't see or hear anyone. I then ran up the stairs. There was no one in the kitchen, in the dining room, or at the bar. When I peeked out the window, mine was the only car in the lot. And then it hit me. Our ghost. It's all I could figure at that point. But the only answer I could come up with was that our helpful ghost had let me out of that fridge, sparing me hours in the cold, and also from the horrifying possibility of having to pee in a corner. I never told anyone about my experience because I didn't want to get into trouble. But I never laughed at anyone again who said that they had encountered the ghost, and that was the last time I went into the basement alone. I'm a park ranger working in the Grand Canyon National Park. I usually end up on daily patrols and bust kids drinking near the edge of the canyon. Sometimes I write citations and tickets for camping violations and reports about wildlife issues. Once in a while, we'll have a missing persons case. Lately, these cases have been becoming more and more common. Now, the first few missing campers broadcast on the news. The first one was a girl last May. She was that hippie free spirit type, driving her van all through the states, stopping in all the best campsites and the best parks all over. She was all by herself, and no one even noticed she was gone till they hadn't seen her posts on Instagram in a few weeks. Her last calls and texts were to her family on the same day that she'd last posted. Her phone was turned off for good that same day, and the geotag pinpointed her in the desert. We sent out a search party, over 100 people canvassing the area. It's pretty tough to survive out in the desert. There's no water, no food, and it's scorching hot during the day and cold at night. We found her van parked and nothing seemed abnormal. She had almonds soaking in a jar to make almond milk or something. She was planning on coming back to that van. It had been a week. So at that point, we assumed we were looking for a body. We didn't find many signs out there in the desert of her at all. The only thing we found that could have been hers was a little fanny pack with some granola bars in it. Really, we don't even know if that was hers or not. The K9 rescue team seemed to think so. In all, though, it was like she vanished into thin air. Now, a young girl going missing is sad, but it isn't too out of the ordinary. There's bad men out there, and a pretty little thing like that is vulnerable. Plus, there's high rocks and sandstorms and risk of heat exhaustion. If you're traveling without a guide, you're an even bigger risk of trouble. It started to get more odd when more and more people were going missing. A young man from Idaho, traveling with his girlfriend, went to go pee behind a rock near Mather Point and never walked back over. There were tons of tourists and hikers nearby. No one saw anything weird, and there weren't any caves or craters around. He just up and vanished. An onlooker had stated they'd seen a blue light flash during the situation, but no one else corroborated their story. The news never mentioned this, and the papers left it out too. I don't think so. The next problem was a family camping out in the trailers. They were a pack of RVers, a husband, wife, and 2 sons about 10 and 12 years old. They'd set out to hike the North Rim and left at around 8 a.m., They'd signed the check-in sheets and denied the opportunity to have a local guide them. By the evening, when they hadn't signed out, we sent out a search party. Helicopters and dog teams and tons of volunteers went out over the next few weeks. There was just nothing coming up. There didn't seem to be any evidence of any foul play. There weren't any storms or abnormalities. There weren't any signs of wildlife, no mountain lions anywhere near the areas, and they definitely couldn't take down a whole family of 4. A husband and wife went missing next. There isn't a ton of information about them, but we think the husband was live streaming right as they went missing. The video footage was scrubbed from the internet, but one of their friends described the clip to me as a witness in our investigation. They told me that the video showed them hiking towards the edge of the canyon, where we think is the Bright Angel trailhead. The wife was walking backwards and laughing when all of the sudden she disappeared from view. The husband dropped down the phone and gasped, and then a bright blue light overtook the screen. At that point, the video feed ended. When we went to check out this site, we didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Of course, we canvassed the area and sent out yet another search crew, but at this point the entire ranger team all were feeling dejected and like the entire operation was pointless. We'd been staying up long nights on these search teams and hadn't solved a single thing. Well, the story starts to get really interesting when the black vans started rolling in. I don't know if they are FBI or CIA or NSA or NASA or what. Maybe some program we don't even know about yet. But they are definitely interested in whatever is going on around the canyon. They've set up shop in a big lot with a tall barbed wire fence surrounding the area. There are always those black vans going out all hours of the day and night. They drive all through the park, but I'm not sure that they always go back in once they've gone out. Well, I've looked over there with my binoculars some nights. Don't judge me. I've started seeing those blue flashes of light once in a while. Usually it's through the windows of some warehouse, but they sometimes just appear out of nowhere, right out in the middle of the lot. The light just pops up for an instant and then it's gone. Whatever is going on, I don't want any part of it. I hope those folks are the good guys and maybe they'll be able to figure out what's going on with the missing people lately. I just hope that they're not the ones causing the problems. So I'm a park ranger in upstate New York. I generally stick around in the winter even though that's a slow time for the park, because I like the quiet. A big part of the job around that time is collecting all the litter and stuff that's been left behind. We have to grab it before the snow comes, or it'll stay there until the spring and make an even bigger mess. Me and another ranger, George, set out on a litter run one day. We set out at like 5 in the morning because we were going to have a blizzard that week. Everyone had been working overtime because we all wanted to leave before it hit. Now, there's a river that runs down the south side of the park. People tend to get real careless around the river. They try to feed the fish, things like that. I was in charge of making sure the riverbank was absolutely clear. We can't afford to have anything that isn't supposed to be there because it's a really fragile ecosystem. So me and George start walking along the riverbank. George is really good at spotting animal tracks and noticing if anything came into the area before us. We've only been walking for a few minutes when he says he sees hoof prints, and we don't allow horseback riding in the park. None of the rangers have horses either. So my first thought is that he must be mistaken. We've all been pulling 14-hour days and hopped up on coffee. It wouldn't be a surprise if he's starting to see things. But then he shows me, and he's right. There's a trail of hoof prints that walks right up to the edge of the river, then doubles back into the forest. And the prints are huge. George says that it's got to be as big as a horse, but it's walking on 2 feet. And we both know that doesn't make any sense. I'm not freaked out, but like, something feels off, you know, and I'm the senior ranger, so I have to make the call on whether we follow those tracks or not. And I say we go. So we follow the prints into the forest. We can tell that the animal is headed southeast, but we've got no clue how long it's been out there. And this is a pretty dense section of the park. Between the mud, the frost, and the undergrowth, it must have had a tough time of it. But the prints are pretty deep. Whatever it is, it's heavy. George thinks it might have come from the highway, way out at the edge of the park. It might be someone's exotic pet that fell off the truck and got lost. We've had situations like that before, and it's always a headache. But we follow the tracks for about 20 minutes and all of a sudden I smell rotten eggs. It makes me want to gag. We can't tell where it's coming from, so we just keep pushing forward. There's a spot where the animal's trail gets really confusing. George says it might have hurt itself and had to start dragging one of its legs. He says the trail ends right at this hollowed-out tree. We approach the tree as cautiously as we can. We don't know if the animal is inside and we can't afford to get hurt. Now the rotten egg smell is really strong and almost metallic. I have to cover my mouth, it's so bad. George looks inside the tree and starts poking at something. He pulls out this thin, stinky, wet pile of fabric. Neither of us have an explanation for it, but then he stretches it out, and we see that it's covered in scales. And I realize that it's not fabric. It's a skin, like a giant lizard or something shedded off. There's the part that would be the torso, and 2 long sleeves for what must be the arms. And we were right. It's got to be human-sized. George holds the skin up like a shirt, and he could fit inside it, easy. Now both of us are ready to call it a day. I radio back to the station for the other rangers. I tell them an estimate of where we are and what we found. There's no sign of the animal. We have no way to tell if it's watching us. George and I head back for the vehicle as fast as we can without making too much noise. When we get back to the station and tell the other rangers, they have a bunch of questions that I don't know how to answer. I don't think anyone would have believed us if we didn't bring back the skin. The head ranger decides we should all avoid that area for the time being. I think he hoped that whatever it is would leave so that we wouldn't have to deal with it. I know I did. We all hustled to finish our work over the next few days. I cleared out before the blizzard hit. I was away from the park for about 3 weeks. When we all came back, the first thing the head ranger had us do was head out to the river area. He wanted to know if there were any signs of the animal. I was hoping it died from the cold, honestly. The snow had thawed a little. It was easy to lead the team to where George and I first found the tracks. Of course, they were buried now. Finding the tree was much harder. We patrolled within a 2, maybe 3-mile radius of where George and I found the skin. When nothing came up, we were all pretty relieved. Maybe the freak had migrated, we didn't know. There are no reptiles native to our park. We're too far north and the cold would kill them. But over the spring and summer, we've kept finding these chunks of lizard skin. Nothing as big as the one George and I brought back, but large enough to be concerning. They all had that same sulfury smell. Maybe the thing is getting injured, I don't know. The park visitors haven't spotted anything yet. George found a trail of hoof prints at the edge of a campsite last week. I'm getting worried. Whatever the creature is, it's tried to hide so far. We don't know how it might interact with humans or if someone could get hurt. I'm from a small town in Louisiana. It's to the southeast of New Orleans, about 45 minutes, and we have a lot of bayous out here. A bayou is kind of swamp-like. The water moves slowly and it can be marshy or lake-like, but it's never really deep. A lot of people out this way go into the bayous to fish or hunt, and I grew up in a family that did the same. My uncle actually ran a business that took groups out into the bayou on an airboat. It was a really small business and mostly for sightseeing alligators, which are very common in Louisiana waterways. If you're from the area, you're familiar with general safety around alligators and know just how prevalent they are. It's not really a concern for the locals, but tourists love seeing alligators, and it was a quick way for my uncle to make money and get to spend his days outside. When my uncle was running the airboat out kind of full-time, usually 4 days a week, a few hours a day, I was in college a few hours away and would come home on weekends. I liked college, but it was draining for me to be in a bigger city and more populated area too, so it was nice to come home and relax a little. Plus, the food was better. On one of my visits home, we had a fried chicken dinner to celebrate my midterms being over. My younger brother, who was going off to college next year, was stirring up a lot of trouble and making everyone laugh. Some of my little cousins were there too, but my Aunt Cheryl said my uncle was taking out the last boat of tourists for the day. It was maybe a little after noon at this point. So we were all helping get dinner ready, shucking corn, mixing the batter, that kind of stuff. or watching football and hanging out. I thought it'd be just another weekend at home, but about 45 minutes later, my uncle showed up looking really distressed. Now, my uncle is a fun-loving guy. He's always got a joke in his back pocket, loves to wrestle and mess around. He's great with his kids and kids in general. But when he stepped into my parents' house, he was out of breath and looked strained, like his face was a purple-red color. My first thought was that he was having a heart attack. My grandma and aunt had him sit down and were fussing around him. My brother and I both noticed what was going on, so we popped into the kitchen from watching football and hung out around the back, trying to pick up what was going on. He drank an entire glass of Coke, and the sugar seemed to help. When he loosened up a little and everyone was going back to their work, he finally admitted that he'd seen something strange in the bayou. Not just him, but 5 tourists he'd had out on the airboat too. He was giving the usual tour when he saw a ripple of water down a side waterway that looked like a decent-sized alligator breaking the surface. That waterway was narrow and not on his usual route, but he decided to head down there anyway due to the possibility of seeing a bigger gator. They'd mostly seen young adults, the teenagers of the gator world who are long and thin. So he maneuvered the airboat carefully down that channel and had everyone keep an eye out a bigger gator, probably hanging around the surface or the shore areas. I interrupted and asked him how far out he was, and he said it was maybe 20 minutes from his dock. He was on a roll now, vomiting the whole story out, and revealed out a younger kid in the group, maybe 10 or 12, called out and pointed. My uncle cut the engine and they drifted a bit while he looked. He obviously has a great eye for gators and saw what the kid was pointing out, but it looked wrong to him. First of all, the scales were a darker blue-green than a gator's and less raised and ridged. They weren't smooth, but close to it. The thing they were looking at was up under a bald cypress with a fair amount of moss hanging off lower broken branches, so it wasn't immediately clear. As they drifted by a few feet, the creature was about 8 or 10 feet away from them. My uncle got a clear look and started the engine back up right away. What he saw wasn't an alligator, but what looked like a lizard man rising half out of the bayou. He was reaching up and gripping the cypress and trying to hide his face, but my uncle could see that his arms were human arms with webbed hands, not the awkward short legs of a gator. It was harder for him to see the face, but he saw a hole on the side of the head that many lizards have as ears, and a snout that was much shorter than a gator's, and like I said, less ridged. The creature was obviously trying to avoid being seen, and my uncle was freaked out, so he drew everyone's attention to the other side of the channel. But a last glimpse showed him that the lizard man was wearing a very tattered shirt that was soaked. He figured a different way back to his dock so they wouldn't have to pass that area. I asked if it was because he wanted the creature to escape, and he said yes, but I think he also just didn't want to see it again. Not too long after that, the tourist season died down a bit, and I was back at college. I heard through the grapevine that my uncle decided to shut down his business and work as an auto service tech instead. He's happy and stays busy, but I think about what he saw sometimes that pushed him away from the bayou he knew like the back of his hand. It doesn't sound like the creature was aggressive or focused on them in any way, so maybe just the possibility that things like that exist was too much for him. My family lived in a rural part of Illinois, and when I was around 10, we moved in with my grandmother because she wasn't doing well. She didn't live too far away from our own house, so usually my mom stayed with my grandma, and my sister and I, with our stepdad Keith, would visit a few times a week and help out with cleaning and other chores. We were very close to my grandma, and she was the quintessential grandma too. She had a snack drawer for when we came over and definitely spoiled us. We weren't close with our dad's side of the family, and our stepdad's parents had passed, so grandma was all we had. Her house was older but in really good shape. She had a bedroom on the first floor since she had trouble going upstairs, and my mom slept in her childhood bedroom on the second floor. When my sister Martha and I stayed over, we'd take sleeping bags on the floor, and it was kind of like camping. But usually we were at home with Keith. I remember very specifically that we had spent the weekend at Grandma's house and had a movie night with popcorn and a ton of quilts. By this time, my grandma was a little out of it and very tired, But she still liked to dote on Martha and I and tell us stories. A lot of them were superstitious. She talked about how she had a baby who died a few months after being born, and how the baby was still in the house with her. This kind of weirded Martha and me out, but our mom acted like it was normal, so we never said anything. But those kind of stories were common. So when Sunday came, we said bye to Grandma, and Keith picked us up to drive us a few miles back to our house. My mom was planning to stay until Monday morning when she had to go into work. She wanted to get some chores done at the house and make extra food for our grandma who couldn't chew well. Martha and I went home, had dinner, played outside for a while, and slept. Nothing seemed too off to us. The next morning, Keith told us in the kitchen that Mom had brought Grandma to the hospital because she wasn't doing well. I wasn't really sure how to feel about that because she'd been to the hospital a few times and always came home after, so it might not be serious. But at that age, when it's your first experience with someone being really sick, it can be confusing. We went to school, and when we got home, Keith picked us up and explained that he thought we should get flowers and some groceries for when Grandma came home. Mom had called him earlier and told him that they were planning on discharging her that afternoon. We stopped at the store quick and then went to Grandma's house. Mom was still at the hospital with her, so we let ourselves in, set up the flowers, and then just kind of hung out watching TV. Keith decided to clean up the yard a bit and left us in the house. It wasn't nighttime yet, but closer to evening for sure, maybe 5 or 6 at night. Martha and I were getting hungry, and to distract ourselves, we wandered around the house looking at Grandma's things, old pictures of our mom and aunts and uncles, stuff like that. On the first floor, we heard a noise that sounded like it came from our grandma's room. The door was open, but Martha said she was sure Mom wasn't here yet. She'd looked out the window upstairs and the driveway was empty. I thought they might have arrived without us noticing and went to Grandma's room to say hi to her. Martha followed me. When we got to the door, we looked in and both saw Grandma sitting in her rocking chair. She looked exactly the same as ever, but didn't say anything to us. Instead, she was sort of staring off into the room. And then Martha and I heard a baby cry. It was very faint, but we both backed up into the living room and checked that the other sibling had heard it. After listening for a minute, we didn't hear it again. Martha went to get Keith to tell him they were back, and I went to find Mom, thinking she was in the kitchen. But after checking the whole downstairs and running upstairs, I didn't find her. Keith and Martha came inside, and within seconds the house phone rang. It was one of those old-school phones that hangs on the wall and has a long cord. Keith picked it up and talked quietly for a little bit. When he hung up, he turned around and told us sadly that our grandma had passed away at the hospital. They thought she'd been doing better, but it had actually been what they refer to as rallying, kind of a last-ditch burst of energy before someone passes away. Mom had called from the hospital to let us know, and when she didn't reach us at home, tried Grandma's house. Martha and I looked at each other right away and told Keith that we'd just seen Grandma in her room less than 10 minutes ago. He seemed skeptical. Keith wasn't a superstitious person, but heard us out. When we were done explaining, he ducked into her room to check and said no one was there. He then checked the rest of the house with us close behind, but we didn't see her again. Eventually, Mom came back from the hospital and we told her what happened too. Our theory as a family was that Grandma passed away and her spirit came back to the house for a bit before moving on. The baby we heard must have been the baby she lost that she'd talk about sometimes. None of us ever saw anything in the house again, and Mom sold it a few years later, but I like to think that Grandma was finally reunited with her baby and found peace. Since then, I've had other experiences, but I'll save those for another day. When you believe in certain things, you notice a lot more than other people around you do. Let me start out by saying that I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means. I believe in science, facts, and numbers. I don't make stuff like this up for attention, and it's important for you to know that. I am first and foremost a pragmatist. That's why I'm so hesitant to tell this story. I haven't told anyone until now, because I'm not even sure if I believe what happened to me that day. I'd been living in West Virginia for a few months. I'm an aerospace engineer, and I'd recently been transferred from Washington. I don't really know why I'm sharing this. Anyway, I was still getting used to my surroundings. I'm a big outdoors person, so I had been exploring the hills and hiking in the majority of my free time. It wasn't necessarily a small town, but things could go pretty still for a while, especially when I was out in the woods. As I said, I'm practical, so I knew better than to wander out at night or go anywhere without protection. Something I had always wanted to do was go and explore West Virginia's caverns. I didn't have a ton of experience spelunking, but I found a bunch of information online for first-timers. So one Sunday I drove out to the caverns. I had all the necessary equipment in my pack with extras of everything, and I felt confident. I geared up in my helmet, headlamp, and knee and elbow pads. I looked pretty goofy, I'll tell you that. I began my exploration. The cavern was structured in a way that the spelunker gradually descended several hundred feet before any serious dips or drops revealed themselves. That was when the adrenaline would kick in and the real exploring would start. As I descended flatly, I passed a handful of groups, a couple trying their hand at adventuring, 2 or 3 seasoned pros here and there, a family with whining children who cut the flattest part of the caving short and turned back. By the time I reached the end of the warm-up descent, the temperature had dropped considerably. I was thankful I'd brought an extra layer. I saw a few different tunnels of varying width, branching out in separate explorations. I set out down one passage that was high and wide enough to stand comfortably, though I sensed this comfort wouldn't last. The rock formations were brilliant, and the atmosphere down there was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. It was so quiet, cool, and serene. The drops became more pronounced, and I figured I was around 300 feet underground at that point. The ground evened out, and the walls of the passage gave way to an open room-like area of the cave, a small, glittering pool rippling in the corner. It was so beautiful. I took a minute to soak it all in. At the far end of the open area, the passage continued, appearing like a black hole leading into nowhere. I suddenly had this feeling. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like claustrophobia, but I'd never had that before. I had always loved stuff like this. I pressed on and shrugged away the feeling. It was a lot darker in this new passageway for some reason, and colder too. I hugged my pack tightly against my shoulders. I heard something. It was like nails dragging down the sides of the rock walls, but coming from the outside. It wasn't possible. With every step I took forward, the clawing sounds got louder. I was convinced that my mind was just playing tricks on me. I'd heard about that happening to spelunkers. But it was just so damn loud at this point, like something was dragging its nails down a chalkboard just inches from my head. I took another step, and when my foot touched the earth, a powerful gust of wind flew back at me, nearly making me lose my balance. Had someone opened a pressurized door at the end of this passageway? No, obviously not. Not possible. Whatever it was, the wind was enough to turn me around. I headed back toward the open area, the darkness stalking me from behind. My feet seemed to move on their own. I was practically jogging as I approached the soft glow of the open area with the pool. I marched straight across to the adjacent passage. Just before I departed from the clearing, I felt something breathing on my neck. There was no mistaking that feeling for coincidence. I froze. I turned. From the blackness of the tunnel on the other side of the room, 2 red dots were glowing at me. Stunned, I blinked. Suddenly it was right in front of me, appearing there instantly and impossibly. I couldn't take my eyes from theirs. I could see a reflection of myself in the cave behind me in those orbs. It shifted, and I looked at its body for the first time. It could have been me in a costume. I wished it were me in a costume. Around 6 feet tall and distinctly humanoid, the creature was covered in oily black fuzz like a gigantic fly. It began to spread its arms, and I was totally consumed by my fear. Large, impossibly large, black bug wings outstretched. They spanned half the length of the creature's body on both sides, and a multitude of tears and rips disconnected the skin from the cartilage. I looked back into its eyes, and the thing was back in the open mouth of the opposite passageway. Its eyes still glowing, the faceless mouth of the creature began to open. This was enough to kick me back into gear. Throwing all caution to the wind, I sprinted as fast as I could out of the tunnel. I could hear the scratching noises all around me, following me, and just as I began to let my fear get the best of me, I saw the brighter glow of the cave's base. Needless to say, I made it out of that tunnel, and I ran the whole way back to my car, ignoring all the crazed looks in my direction. I still don't believe what I saw. I am a practical individual, and I don't believe in ghosts or monsters or aliens or anything like that. But I do believe that I outran something terrible that day, and I won't be heading back into those caves anytime soon. I was always a skeptic when it came to the weird paranormal stuff, but now I'm a true believer thanks to a series of strange occurrences that I experienced firsthand. I'm a small-town cop in rural Michigan. I was born and raised here, and I can't imagine being anywhere else. When I was growing up, I remember stories about haunted places and Bigfoot sightings. They were just stories to scare kids, and I eventually grew out of it. There's one story in particular about an old abandoned house in the woods on the outskirts of town. It was built in the 1800s, and the patriarch of the family supposedly went crazy, claiming to see demons before killing his partner and kids, then himself. There's no record that it actually happened, so I chalked it up to urban legend, but generations of kids dared each other to go in that house by themselves. Even I went there in high school. It was like a rite of passage. Sure, it's creepy, but it's old and dilapidated, so what do you expect? Nothing ever happened anyway, and you end up scaring yourself with anticipation. In recent years, it's been a home to junkies, so it's not very safe. I think that contributed to waning interest in the place until a tragic incident a year ago. A few high school kids went to the house and messed around with an Ouija board. A few days later, one of them hung himself in the house. It was a pretty big deal around here, and a lot of people were spooked. Some were convinced the kid was possessed by demons, but if you look at his history, he was bullied at school and didn't have many friends. In fact, the group he went with were not his real friends, and they admitted they only took him there to play a prank, which they filmed and posted online. That being said, his family claimed he kept talking about a being he kept seeing leading up to his death. He described it as human, but not human. It was gaunt and naked, with pale white skin. Its eyes were black, it had no nose, and it made a clicking sound with its tongue and thin lips. People wanted to believe the sensational version, but I thought it was a textbook case of a poor kid being bullied. The thing he described sounded like a junkie he may have run into at the house, and maybe he had some bad dreams about it. Nonetheless, it started a ghost challenge trend online where kids would go in the house and post videos on social media. I've seen some of these videos and they're clearly fake, designed to set up a cheap jump scare. Some even use poor CGI effects. But 6 months later, there was another incident. A girl and her friends took up the ghost challenge. Then late one night, she drove off a road and died when she crashed into a tree. Again, people said it was demons, but really that road is dark, twisty, and infamous for car wrecks. As tragic as it was, I didn't question it because accidents happened there frequently. We talked to her friends and they were scared, claiming the girl rambled about a strange being she kept seeing in her bedroom. What she described was the exact same thing the other kids saw. I admit it was weird, but rumors about the other kid had already been going around, so she could have easily been influenced by that. The incident was enough so that there were calls to demolish the house and make the area off limits. I was tasked with boarding the place up and cordoning it off with police tape. Meanwhile, plans were made to tear the house down in a week. I drove there by myself one afternoon, and maybe it was because of everything going on, but I was pretty anxious. I went in the house to chase out junkies, and as I looked around, I heard a weird clicking sound, like something you make with your tongue. I immediately thought about what that kid heard, but I was sure it was someone high on drugs. I did a sweep of the house but found no one. I kept hearing that clicking sound, always coming from another room, but when I'd look in that room, it was empty, and the sound would come from a different room. It started to freak me out, so I quickly nailed the door shut, put up the police tape, and hightailed it out of there. As I walked to my car, the clicking sound followed behind me at a distance. I started to run, but the sound got louder and louder until it was directly in my ear. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I finally jumped in my car and sped off. I didn't hear that sound anymore, and I refused to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I'd see. When I got home, I sat in the car for a while, trying to process what happened. It was long enough so that my partner eventually came out to see what was wrong, but I didn't tell her. Later that night, I saw it. I woke up after a horrible nightmare and I couldn't move a muscle, like sleep paralysis. A figure stood at the foot of my bed watching me. It was ghostly, naked and pale, exactly like those kids described. Its eyes were black, round voids. My partner slept soundly next to me, but that thing wasn't interested in her, it only focused on me. I was petrified, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I stared at it for hours until dawn, when it finally faded away as the sun came up. I've heard sleep paralysis can be terrifying, and similar to what I experienced, so I told myself that's just what it was. But then it happened again. The second time, I woke up to find the figure standing right next to me. The third time, it leaned directly over me from the head of the bed, which is impossible because the bed is pushed up against the wall. I barely got any sleep and I felt like I was losing my mind. I was afraid to tell anyone because I'd be ridiculed, but my partner and coworkers definitely noticed I was distracted. A week later, they finally demolished that house and everything stopped. It took a while for my mind to settle, but I was eventually able to sleep again. I can't prove that what I experienced was real, but I know in my gut that it was, and I don't doubt those kids anymore. Hopefully, we won't be plagued by that nightmare again. I would appreciate your opinion on what I experienced in Missouri a few summers ago. My spouse and I were overdue for a vacation, and we wanted to get out of the state and forget the world for a while. We ended up renting this amazing cottage on hundreds of acres of land in Missouri. It was gorgeous. There were rolling hills and woods as far as the eye could see, and a beautiful river that ran right through the property. My favorite thing about it all was there was a hot tub in a covered lanai where you could sit and take in the sights. I wanted to check out the whole property one day, so I followed the property line and ended up going deep into the woods. The wildlife around there was incredible, and I even saw black bears and wild boars roaming around carefree. It was nature's beauty at its finest. I would love to know what that property cost. I got to this one area of the woods where the river ran right through, and you could follow the river for miles. I did this for a while, and I saw this big, majestic bison drinking right out of the river. I was pissed I didn't have my phone with me to take a picture, but I was determined to get as close to it as possible. The closer I got to it, however, the less it looked like a bison. It was huge and furry like one, but it had these jagged spines along its back like nothing I'd ever seen on an animal before. It also had one giant horn on top of its head like a rhino. It was the strangest looking creature I'd ever seen before. It started freaking me out the closer I got to it, and I decided to keep a healthy distance between it, as I had no idea what it was. It took massive gulps of water at a time, and I could hear it from a decent distance away. Suddenly, the beast looked at me and I was terrified. It had one giant eye and it screamed at me so loudly it shook the ground. I immediately took off into the woods and I must have been so scared that I passed out. I woke up later that night in the dark with no phone and no flashlight miles away from the cottage. I had no idea where I was and didn't know what direction to start walking in. I kept screaming my spouse's name, but I didn't hear anything back. I was really scared, and it crossed my mind that I might die in the middle of the woods that night with nobody around to find me. I finally found the river and figured I would follow the river and keep an eye out for anything that looked familiar. I kept walking and walking alongside the river, and eventually I smelt the faint smell of a campfire. My spouse must have lit one. I kept following the river and the smell of the campfire got stronger and stronger. Finally, I saw the campfire and the cottage and made my way towards it. By this point, I was beyond exhausted, hungry, and dehydrated. I got close to the campfire and I must have passed out again. The next thing I know, I woke up in the hospital with my spouse sitting next to my bed. I told my spouse about the nasty beast I saw. I talked about the large bison-like body, the jagged spikes across its back, the giant horn on its head, and the most unusual part, its big singular eye. My spouse told me I was just hallucinating from the dehydration, and I just needed rest. The nurse came in to check on me, and I told her all about the creature I saw. She told me about an urban legend that was unique to Missouri called the Myuu, which fit the exact physical characteristics that I described. When I looked it up, it said that anybody who saw it became crazy, writhed around in unspeakable pain, and was only relieved from these ailments through inevitable death. Luckily, I never experienced any of those awful things, and I am still very much alive to tell the tale. It has me believing, however, that maybe what I saw wasn't a one-of-a-kind creature, but a more common creature that was relatively rare and commonly mistaken as this mythical one. I will say one thing, though: the beast's scream was the worst thing I've ever heard to this day. The scream was not an ordinary roar of an animal. It shook me and everything around it, and it made me immediately fear for my safety and my life. Everyone I tell this story stops believing me the minute I mention it only had one eye, but that's the part that's the most burnt into my memory. What a hideous creature I saw that day. I will never forget seeing it and hope I never see it or anything like it ever again. Let me know if you have any insight on what this creature could have been. My dad was driving and I was in the passenger seat. We were going to visit my grandparents for the weekend, something we used to do about twice a month. It was about a 2-hour drive up the Wyoming mountains surrounded by beautiful views and heavy woods. I always looked forward to it because my dad and I could get some quality time together. On this night, it was very dark and a little foggy. My dad and I were making good time when we saw a man standing in the middle of the road. As we got closer, we realized that the man was completely naked. He was bald and didn't have any hair on his entire body. "Damn meth heads," my dad uttered under breath, something he uttered quite often. On top of being completely naked, the man looked weird. He had no expression on his face and was very pale. He started walking towards the car, and it made my dad and I uncomfortable. As he got closer, I saw that eyes were completely black. Not dark, I mean black and beady. Something was definitely not right about this guy. As the man got closer, my dad put the car in reverse and was going to drive by him and continue down the road. As we started driving backwards, the man started running at us. My dad floored it, and the scariest thing happened. The man dropped on all fours and ran at us at a crazy speed. He was salivating all over his face, and his neck kept popping back disturbingly as he ran. As soon as there was a little distance between us, my dad slammed on the brakes, put the car in drive, and swerved around whatever was chasing us. The creature dove towards the car and got really close to my car door, but we were able to escape untouched. I will always remember its face a short distance from my window looking at me. It was the most horrible thing I've ever witnessed. It had nasty yellow teeth that looked really sharp, and its body was ghostly white and veiny. But the worst part is still those little black soulless eyes. I turned and asked my dad what that thing was, and he told me that's what happens when you take meth. It was a pretty quiet ride after that. We were both trying to figure out what the hell that thing was. My dad kept looking in the rearview mirror during the drive, and I know it was to make sure that thing wouldn't get us. I mentioned to my dad that its neck moved around like crazy as it ran, and he explained that meth heads' bones deteriorate from the drug use, and it causes it to look like that. I mentioned the sharp yellow teeth, and he said that soon they would get even worse and fall out due to drug use. I asked how he was able to run so fast on all fours, and he said that they lose strength in their legs and must learn to run around like that. I asked why the eyes were so black and devoid of life, and he said that meth attacked the eyes and made people go blind. He had an answer for everything, so I just dropped it, but I never forgot about it. When we got to my grandparents, I told them all about it. I told them about its freaky eyes, bizarre teeth, nasty skin, and how it charged at us on all fours, and they told me it was just my imagination. That really hurt, having loved ones accuse me of lying, but later I figured out they were just trying to calm me down and protect me. I remember when we were heading home, I asked my dad if we were going to see the creature again, and he pretended like he didn't know what I was talking about. When I explained the creature and how it charged at us, he told me it must have been a vivid nightmare. I knew I wasn't going crazy, and I was pissed at my dad. But being a parent now, I kind of get it. Life's tough enough as it is. Can't have your children worrying about something they can't defend themselves against. Back then, my dad blew it off, but now we talk about all the possible things it could have been. For a while, my dad thought it was the Slender Man, but the Slender Man supposedly has no face. This thing definitely had a face, and a creepy one at that. We also thought it could have been a vampire, but all its teeth were long. Everyone I've told this story to have a different opinion of what it could have been. Some have claimed it's a creature called a crawler, and that thing apparently also runs on all fours. Some people have told me it was an animal, and the fog made it look like a humanoid creature, which is just insulting. I drive an aviation fuel truck at LAX, so I get all around the airport and I pretty much see everything. Most days, though, I'm close to the terminal, refueling planes before they take off. One day, when I had just driven back to the fuel farm to refill the truck, I got a call asking me to make an unscheduled fueling. They said that the plane I was supposed to do next hadn't arrived anyway. I was told to go out to this hangar that I'd never been to before. Since we usually refuel planes at the terminal, I was kind of surprised. When I got out to this small hangar, I saw just one small regional jet sitting outside. I checked, and it was the one I was supposed to refuel, so I attached ground wire and then the fuel hose like always. While I waited for the plane to fill up, I looked around and noticed there was another hangar a few hundred feet or so away from the one I was at. That hangar looked kind of old, and it was fairly small too, not big enough for the Airbus A350 or something like that. As I watched, black cars and SUVs kept coming and going by that little hangar. Instead of the mechanics and fueler who wear orange safety vests like me, I saw guys wearing black or blue jumpsuits. I don't know, it wasn't just the outfits. Something about them looked different than regular airport workers. The small plane didn't take long to get fueled. I took off the ground wire, disconnected the hose, got back in the truck, and recorded it on the refuel sheet. Once I finished, I looked over toward that hangar again. I didn't see anyone going in or out, just the cars parked in front. I decided to just drive by it on my way back to the terminal. I didn't think anyone would notice a fueling truck just getting a little close to it. I don't know why, but when I got close, I decided to roll down the window. I didn't get more than 50 feet or so from the cars parked in front, but I heard a banging noise from inside the hangar. It didn't sound like anything you'd expect to hear from a hangar, not like a plane engine or a mechanic working on a plane. When I heard that noise, I pictured huge fists pounding on metal. I don't know why. I told myself I was being crazy, but then I heard a roar coming out of that hangar, like King Kong or something. I rolled up the window and drove away. I was sure something was going on in that hangar. When I got home that night, I checked Google Earth to see if I could find that hangar, but I couldn't see it. It wasn't on the map I had of the hangars at LAX either. I mean, I could see if it was too small to be on my map, but why wasn't it on Google Earth? That was weird. I hadn't seen any signs on it indicating what it was either. I thought I'd try to get over there again sometime and see if I could get a better look at it. But our schedules are pretty tight. We go from one refueling to the next, and there's no extra time unless a plane gets stuck at another airport. Finally, one day a plane couldn't make it to LAX because of a mechanical issue, and I had an extra hour to kill. I had to go to the fueling farm to fill the truck, but I had enough time to swing by the hangar. This time I looked at the hangar itself more closely. I still didn't see any markings on it. No names of airlines that use it. No numbers. Just 3 cars were in front of it this time. One guy came out in a dark jumpsuit as I drove by, but he was hurrying into one of the cars and I don't think he noticed my truck. After his car pulled away, I drove closer, rolled down the window, and heard banging again. This time it sounded like a fight. I swear it sounded like two big monsters in there throwing each other against the wall. But I don't know. Maybe it was something else. All I know is it didn't sound normal. The next day I was really surprised that I got a break again. In fact, I had even more time because a bunch of flights got grounded in Chicago for weather. We were just sitting around with hardly any planes to fuel. When the truck needed more fuel, I headed back to the fuel farm with at least a 2-hour break ahead of me. This time, I went to that smaller hangar that I'd first seen the weird hangar from. I thought if I parked near it for a while, no one would notice. I sat there and ate my lunch, just kind of idly watching the mysterious hangar. From that far away, there was no way I could hear anything, even with the windows down, so I just watched. Cars came and went, and then a plain white truck that looked like a big moving van backed in. The driver didn't get out. I wondered if they were loading something into the back. A few minutes later, another truck just like it backed in. I was going crazy wishing I could see what they were doing. But the way they were backed in totally blocked my view. Both vans pulled out, and after that all the cars parked there slowly left. Once they were all gone, I drove the truck up to the hangar. I got really close this time and rolled down the window. I heard nothing. It was totally quiet. I figure whatever was in that hangar was gone. They must have taken it away in the truck. I still don't know what it was. Since then, anytime I manage to go by the hangar, it's totally quiet. But something tells me they're going to put something else in there. I'm going to keep watching it and see what happens. I'll just get to the point. I grew up in a haunted house. My childhood home was not some creepy old mansion next to a cemetery like in a movie. No, it was just a regular house in a regular neighborhood. My earliest memories of the house were pretty uneventful, but unfortunately my mom died unexpectedly of a heart attack when I was 9. My older brother took it pretty hard, and my dad was a complete mess. I struggled with it too, but we stuck together and got through it together. It was about 6 months later when strange things began to happen. It was little things at first, the type of things you don't notice right away. Like I'd put the TV remote down, go to the bathroom, but when I came back, it would be in a different place. It was enough to notice, but also subtle enough so that it could have been my imagination. After a while, it started to happen more frequently and more obvious. Like stuff would disappear and reappear in a different room. Doors would open and close by themselves. And late at night, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway. My mom had a sewing room and used to spend a lot of time there. She'd make all kinds of things, blankets, shirts, dolls, dresses, whatever. She just loved to create. This was actually the room where she died. My dad was hesitant to get rid of anything, so we just left it as it was. I used to watch Mom sew all the time, and after she died, I found myself hanging out there a lot. I began to notice the smell of Mom's perfume. I found comfort in that, and as a little kid, I just thought the smell lingered from when she was alive, maybe caught in the fabric or clothes. Sometimes I'd smell it right before I went to bed, as if Mom was tucking me in and saying goodnight. I became convinced that Mom was checking in on us, and I wasn't scared. My dad and brother were aware of some of the things going on. I mean, it's hard to ignore doors opening and closing by themselves or stuff mysteriously disappearing. But Dad got offended when I suggested it might be Mom's ghost, so I just kept everything to myself. That's when I started seeing the shadow. It was only wisps out of the corner of my eye, always darting out of the sewing room. Soon after, I'd see an actual figure standing in the hallway. It was a silhouette, shaped like a person, but it was amorphous, not a solid figure. What creeped me out was that it was jet black, blacker than black. The shadow was always preceded by the smell of my mom's perfume, and at first I was sure it was Mom, until I noticed it was taller than her and had a broader frame. And while the previous incidents were innocuous enough, this shadow gave me a different feeling. It had a presence, a power to it, but it was negative and dark. One time I was hanging out in my mom's sewing room, just sitting at her table, drifting off to sleep. I could smell her perfume as I dozed off, which gave me a sense of comfort. But then I heard her call my name, a whisper, directly in my ear. I woke up and saw the shadow standing in the corner. I could feel it looking at me. The hair on my head stood straight up, and there was this sense of urgency to get out of there as fast as I could. I ran for the door, but the shadow came right at me. I burst into the hall screaming and slammed the door shut. My dad and brother came running to see what happened, and that's when they noticed my shirt was torn and there were scratches on my shoulder. I started crying and told them what I saw, but my dad actually got angry and refused to believe it. I never went in my mom's sewing room again, and we kept the door locked. Thing is, whenever I walked by the room alone, I smelled her perfume and heard her calling me from behind the door. It would never happen with my dad or brother around, only if I was by myself. I was afraid to talk to anyone about it, but I finally got the nerve to ask my brother. He had never seen the shadow himself, but he believed me. Or he at least believed that I believed what I saw was real. I just felt like Dad was hiding something from us. My brother had no explanation but thought I should cut Dad some slack because he was still having a rough time. As long as we kept the door to the sewing room shut, I never saw the shadow. It still tried to lure me in with the smell of Mom's perfume and her voice, but I ignored it. I couldn't help but think it had something to do with her death. A year later, we finally moved out of that house. Thankfully, there were no strange occurrences at our new home, and whatever I experienced gradually faded from my memory with time. Over the years, it's been hard to think about Mom and not be reminded about what happened. Recently, I've become concerned because I started smelling my mom's perfume again. I was in denial at first, but then I started hearing her call out to me from empty rooms. I'm now seeing wisps of shadows out of the corner of my eyes. You don't have to believe me, but I swear this is true. I don't know what to think, and I'm just bracing for what happens next.